you're doing well. I hope, all right. I hope you're doing well this morning. I hope that we can re-energize some of you if you haven't had your cup of morning coffee yet. But welcome to the workshop, Monitoring and Preventing Grassland Loss Using Today's Tech. And so I want to personally thank each and every one of you for signing up for this workshop. Without your support, of course, this workshop would not be possible. The amount of RSVPs that we got, it far exceeded my expectations. The last time I looked at the RSVP list, we got about 55 people who signed up for this workshop. And so I want to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers this morning. And let me go ahead and change my slide here, close out of this. Okay. So our guest speakers that we have today are Dr. Victoria Donovan. She is an assistant professor of forest management. And she also graduated from the University of Florida. And then our next guest speaker following her up is going to be Dr. Dillon Fogarty. I hope I said your last name correctly. He is research assistant professor and woody invasions ecologist, as well as the program coordinator for working lands conservation. And then we have myself, master student of Rangeland Wildlife Fisheries Management from Texas A&M University. And following me will be Dr. Morgan Treadwell, Extension Range Specialist from the Department of Rangeland and Wildlife Fisheries Management. And following Dr. Treadwell, we will have Chase Brook, Extension Program Specialist out of McKinney. And so this is our lineup for today. Just to kind of get our brains going this morning, I wanted to pose a question. So how can we use the latest resources and tools available to manage and prevent woody species from spreading? And so we hope to answer that question today, looking at past, current research that's going on with some of these different, some of this technology, and also how maybe if you're an extension agent or educator, how you can technology maybe in the classroom as well. And so I think without further ado, we are recording. That is good. I'm going to go ahead and kick this off to Dr. Donovan this morning. So Dr. Donovan, are you ready to go this morning?
I hope so.
Let's
give this tech a try and make sure it all works here.
Before you begin, if any of y'all have questions during your talk, please feel free to leave it in the chat. We should still have some time after her talk to maybe answer a couple questions or so. But at the very end of this event, we will have a Q&A session with the speakers this morning. So don't be afraid if you forget or if you remember a question later on, you'll have the chance again to ask it to that select speaker.
All right, so can everyone hear me all right and you can see my slides?
Yes, I can hear you perfect. Slides look great.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. So as Erica mentioned, my name's Victoria Donovan. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences at the University of Florida. And I work out of the West Florida Research and Education Center in the Panhandle. I did my PhD and my postdoc at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is why you'll see a lot of what I'm talking about today. A lot of my research is really focused in the Great Plains. So I want to start off by just talking about what is woody encroachment. You know, people here know that producers in the Great Plains are facing a number of threats and challenges, from invasive species, changing climate, leading to more frequent droughts and other abnormal weather events, increasing numbers of wildfires. But one of the greatest threats that's been identified to livestock production in the Great Plains is woody encroachment. So woody encroachment is an increase in the density, cover, and biomass of woody plants in grassy ecosystems, so grasslands and savannas. And it's been recognized as a problem in rangelands for decades. But we've been struggling to control and combat this problem. And so we're continuously working on unlocking new tools to help us understand both how this problem is expanding and then also how we can try to control woody encroachment and kind of monitor some of our management outcomes. So that's what I want to talk with you about today. I'm going to start off by reviewing kind of what woody encroachment is, what it does to ecosystems, and then kind of its ecological and biological processes. And then I'm going to talk specifically about the Rangeland Analysis Platform, or the RAP. I want to go through kind of basics of how we just can use the RAP as a tool, and then show you some examples of how we've used that in research to kind of track woody encroachment, and how someone might be able to use that, producer might be able to use it as a tool on their land specifically. So to start off, why is woody encroachment bad? Well, one of the main things that a lot of people are going to be concerned about is it drives forage production loss. So a study that was conducted by Morford et al., they tracked the loss of herbaceous biomass across Western rangelands, so both the Western US and the Great Plains, and they were looking between 1990 and 2021. And they found that we lost 302 trillion grams of herbaceous biomass due to tree expansion alone, which equates to about 4.1 to 5.6 billion US dollars in potential lost revenue for producers. So this is a major issue, of course, for woody encroachment. Another concern for a lot of people is decreased grassland diversity. So if we look at eastern red cedar or juniper encroachment, which is happening across the Great Plains, it's actually been shown to decrease plant biodiversity by 90%. So I've got a couple of plots here taken by from a study by Knapp et al. In 2008. This inset bar plot here is looking at the change in plant species richness as we go from a grassland to kind of an encroached state, more of a shrubby state, and then to a full juniper woodland where we're looking at plant diversity in the understory of that woodland. And what you can see is this drastic loss in species richness. And then this dot plot here is showing you the same thing. They're looking really at plant species richness on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, they're tracking how plant species richness changes relative to the density of juniper trees. And you can see this sharp decline in plant species richness as we increase the number of trees per hectare. It's not just plant biodiversity, it's also wildlife as well. So in this study, Chapman et al., we're tracking the change in bird community composition, our species diversity relative to eastern red cedar cover. And again, they track this loss in diversity associated with our bird community as we increase the percent cover of eastern red cedar. Another major concern is that woody encroachment increases wildfire risk. This is something that I've spent a lot of time researching, so I apologize if I spent a little bit of extra time talking about this. But in a study we conducted back in 2020, we wanted to see where a lot of these large wildfires that are increasing in the Great Plains, where are they happening? What kind of land use types are they occurring in? So we looked at the propensity for large wildfire in herbaceous vegetation, woody crops, pasture and hay fields, and developed areas. And what we found is that woody vegetation had the highest large wildfire risk compared to all of these other land use types. And when we tracked large wildfire risk relative to the amount of woody cover on a landscape, what we found is that when you exceed about 10 to 20% woody cover on your landscape, you have this elevated large wildfire risk. And we think the reason for this is because woody vegetation just creates really extreme wildfire behavior that's much more difficult for us to suppress. And you can see that pretty clearly in the image that I have here, where you can see the flame lengths of a prescribed fire as they're going through a grassland versus when one of these juniper trees ignites. Another study that we conducted looked specifically at spot fire distances, and basically spot fires are fires that start outside of the original fire perimeter. They're a concern because it makes it really challenging for us to control wildfires when they can travel, large distances. They're difficult for us to monitor, and so they can start new fires in new locations. Another thing is these spot fires they're created by lofted embers, and so these lofted embers are often the things that land on structures, so on roofs, or they get sucked into ventilation systems, and they're the major reason why we see structure destruction during wildfires. And so what we found is that the amount of area that's exposed to spot fire greatly increases when we shift from a grassland state to a woodland state. All of these different box plots here are basically showing different wind speeds the fire's occurring under. And then we have this receptive fuel area exposed. So that's the amount of area that's exposed to these spot fires. And so you can see that pretty drastic increase where we're going from less than 5,000 hectares to potentially more than 20,000 hectares of exposure for these spot fires. There are many other reasons as well that I'm not going to go into today. Woody encroachment, for instance, can impact carbon storage. We shift from below ground to above ground carbon storage. It alters soil dynamics. It can impact the water table and have negative effects on water resources. Cedar trees are associated with things like cedar apple rust. They can also exacerbate allergies, and the list goes on and on. So there are a number of reasons why people need to be concerned about woody encroachment in the Great Plains. The next thing I kind of want to talk about is why is woody encroachment happening? Why are we seeing this pattern at all? So for over 10,000 years in the Great Plains before Euro-American settlement, fire was as frequent as every year here. In fact, this region was one of the most frequently burned regions in the United States prior to Euro-American settlement. And so the map that I'm showing on this slide here is looking at differences in mean fire return interval across the US before Euro-American settlement. And the darker orange areas are areas that have the smallest fire return interval. So they saw the most frequent fire. And so you can see that the Great Plains had a really frequent fire return interval. These fires were started both by lightning-started wildfires, as well as fires stewarded by Native Americans, and they burned across vast areas in the Great Plains, generating complex structures and rangeland ecosystems that we know today. And so these systems that we're managing today were fundamentally shaped by this frequent fire and the interactions between fire and grazing. And it's really clear that fire has played a key role in the dominance of grasslands actually across not only the Great Plains, but globally. So basically, when we go way back in time to when grasslands began spreading across the earth, when they first emerged on the planet, what we can see is that their spread, their emergence actually coincides with fire occurrence. So in this plot here, we're looking at relative charcoal flux in ocean sediment, which is just basically a way to show us fire occurrence, how much fire was burning a really long time ago. And so we've got that on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we've got millions of years. And you can see this spike in fire occurrence that occurs just around 10 million years ago. And that coincides with a big spike in when grassland and savanna started emerging across the globe. So it's actually really well established now in the scientific literature that the existence of many of Earth's grasslands is actually dependent on this frequent fire. And we often think about this relationship in terms of a grass fire cycle. So grasses have are really fine fuels. So they're really pyrogenic. They burn really easily. And so this promotes frequent fires in these areas. And as fires become more frequent, they're able to prevent trees and shrubs from establishing because they consume both seeds and the juvenile phases of trees and shrubs, which tend to be more sensitive to fire. This in turn helps to promote grasses, since the shrubs and trees shade out grasses, and that continues to promote more fire. And so we continue to go through these phases over and over. So it makes the existence of this expansive grassland region in the Great Plains, it makes sense that this area is dependent on these frequent fires that we had historically. However, when Europeans settled in the United States, they displaced Native Americans from their lands, which means that this Native American fire stewardship that we saw was largely eradicated from the Great Plains, with the exception of some areas like the Flint Hills, where European settlers continued frequent fire. And then we also saw this shift towards fire suppression activities as well. So when we did have lightning strike fires occur, we moved to immediately suppress these fires. So we had this rapid shift in fire culture where we went from actively promoting fires to actively suppressing them. And this almost completely eliminated fire from the Great Plains. Now, by European settlers basically unknowingly generated the problem of woody encroachment into our grasslands by removing this controlling feedback with fire that prevented woody establishment. So if we look at eastern red cedar, for instance, which again it's a common native invader across the Great Plains, before European settlement, generally, we would have had fires consume the juvenile stages and seeds of eastern red cedar when it tried to move into grasslands. And this prevented cedars from reaching maturity and kind of transitioning us over to a cedar woodland. However, when we removed fire, these cedar trees were able to spread out of the ravines and gullies where they would have persisted historically. Because there was no fire to knock back the juveniles. And so we started to see these cedars reach maturity, and then we're starting to see them transition towards these mature cedar woodland states. Now, this problem is even further exacerbated for eastern red cedar by tree plantings for windbreaks. So following the Dust Bowl, many people began planting windbreaks to protect their livestock, their homesteads, their soils. And planting native trees like eastern red cedar makes a lot of sense because they're able to survive the conditions in the Great Plains, and they're a natural element on this landscape. However, without fire, these cedar trees are able to spread from these tree plantings into areas that previously wouldn't have been exposed to propagule pressure, to these seeds and early stages of recruitment. And so what we can see is that cedars can actually spread a massive distance from established windbreaks and those natural areas like ravines. And so in this plot here, what you're looking at is the number of eastern red cedar trees on the y-axis and comparing that to the distance they were from the seed source, so that mature stand, whether that be a windbreak or whether that be a natural location of occurrence. And we're looking at that in yards. And so what you can see is that, a lot of these eastern red cedar trees that are spreading from established mature stands are occurring very close to that stand, but they can spread over 1,000 yards away from a windbreak or a seed source location. So they can rapidly spread over large distances from these areas. And so windbreaks have really helped to advance woody encroachment by adding propagule sources to intact rangelands where we wouldn't have had this propagule pressure previously. Now, we actually did a study tracking the spread of cedar from windbreaks in the Nebraska sandhills. This is an area that was assumed to not be that susceptible to encroachment in Nebraska. And so what you can see in these images here, this gray area is Nebraska. The white area within it is the Nebraska Sandhills ecoregion. And all of these black dots here are locations of cedar windbreaks that we assessed. And you can see an example here of the satellite imagery we use to track established spread of eastern red cedar. So you can see a windbreak and then all of these established trees that have spread from that windbreak. And what we found in this study is that 25% of windbreaks had established spread of eastern red cedar in the Nebraska sandhills. And you can see that's even in the face of grazing. You can see these active cattle trails associated with these pastures as well. So what we know is that woody encroachment is happening in the Great Plains, and it's happening at really rapid rates. When we track tree cover across the Great Plains, this plot was actually created using the RAP data. what we see is that we've lost over 20 million acres to woody encroachment over the last 30 years. So here you're looking at tree cover in acres on the y-axis and comparing that to year on the x-axis. This tree cover expansion is driving declines in grasslands at approximately the same rate or close to the same rate as land use conversion. So in this plot, we're looking at the acres lost to land use versus tree cover expansion versus year on the x-axis here. So this blue line is looking at the amount of acres lost between 2008 and 2016 to land use conversion. And the green line is looking at land lost to tree cover expansion. You can see that we've lost over 4 million acres just over this 8-year period. So when we're talking about this and we're talking about cedar spread, what's really clear is that woody encroachment, as it spreads, is spatially contagious. So the woody transition process begins at our established stand, and we start to see encroachment happening as we move out from that established stand, where we start to see a couple of trees starting to mature. Maybe they're able to disperse a couple seeds. And then we have dispersal and recruitment phase outside of that. So as we move farther away, we might see some really young juvenile trees. We might see some seeds landing in that location. And then finally, we have our intact grassland on the outside of that boundary. And so we can classify these phases of woody encroachment, calling them the woodland transition, the encroachment phase, a dispersal and recruitment phase, and an intact grassland. I'm going to talk about these a couple more times, these phases, during this talk. Now, if you want to learn more about these phases, and if you want to learn more specifically about integrated management relative to these phases, I want to point you towards this risk and vulnerability guide. It can help you identify the risk and vulnerability on a specific land parcel, and it also can tell you what type of management approaches you use at each phase of encroachment. So the threat to rangelands with this spatially contagious process, the threat to rangelands continues to get more and more magnified the more widely distributed woody vegetation gets. So in this figure, we're looking at a map of signals of early transition from a grassland to a woodland. And what you can see over an 18-year period is we're seeing this massive transition, this spatially contagious transition, moving from the eastern Great Plains over to the west. And so all of the dark red areas are showing areas that are either in that woody transition phase or are experiencing encroachment. The yellow areas are areas more associated with that early dispersal and recruitment. And then the blue areas are the areas where we still have intact grasslands. So when we have such a large scale problem that's clearly functioning over space, how can we combat that problem? We need to be able to identify the stages of encroachment that our land is in, including whether we're kind of at risk. So how do we know if we have intact grasslands, how do we know what our risk level is relative to the distribution of woody vegetation? If we're experiencing or if we do know that we have some encroachment, how much do we have and how can we quantify it? Or if we know we have woody encroachment and we're already treating it, how do we, save money and time monitoring the outcomes of that woody encroachment across our property? Or sorry, the outcomes of that management for woody encroachment across our property. And so this is really where the RAP comes in and can really help us out with some of these problems. And so I'm going to spend the rest of my time today reviewing the RAP, what it is, how we can use it, and how it can be useful for tracking both woody encroachment and management outcomes. So the RAP, or the Rangeland Analysis Platform, is an online tool that allows you to visualize and analyze vegetation data across the entire continuous US. It has annual records for every year between 1986 and 2022. So we have this huge temporal data set that allows us to track changes in vegetation through time. And it's also at a very fine resolution for these types of data sets. So the resolution is 30 meters, which means that vegetation like cover or biomass is estimated within a 30 by 30 meter square. You can access the Rangeland Analysis Platform by going to the link that I have on the slide here, so rangelands.app. If you go to this link, this is the web page that's going to be pulled up. I'm going to go through a number of screenshots now to kind of show you how you can maneuver through the wrap and use its different features. So when you get to this web page, you can launch the wrap by either clicking on Launch Wrap in the toolbar or below the title for the Rangeland Analysis Platform. When you get inside the wrap portal, you're going to see a large map, and then you also have this white box on the side, which lets you control what features you're seeing on your map. So right now we're looking at percent cover, and you can see the little yellow tab is clicked for cover here on the side. And we're looking specifically at perennial forb and grass cover, which you can see from that drop-down list that that's what's been selected. Below that, you see a color legend. So we know that the darkest green is looking at 100% perennial forb and grass cover, whereas the light areas are close to 0. And then finally, if you go over to the far right-hand side of this box, you can see the year that we're looking at, which is 2022. The other thing that I'll note is that you can see there's a yellow tab selected here to exclude croplands, development, and water. So basically, these are areas where there's going to be inaccuracies with the wrap, and so they've excluded those from the cover data set, but you can turn that off if you want to see what that looks like as well. You can navigate between different functional groups by clicking on the drop-down menu for cover. You can choose perennial forbs and grasses, annual forbs and grasses, shrubs, trees, and bare ground. And then you can also look at biomass as well. So if you turn off the yellow tab for cover and turn on the tab for biomass, here you'll see we're looking at herbaceous biomass now across the continuous US, measured in pounds per acre, where the dark green areas have the highest herbaceous biomass. You can also select to look at, instead of herbaceous biomass, you can look at annual forb and grass biomass or perennial forb and grass biomass specifically. But I want to focus today specifically on looking at trees, since we're talking about woody encroachment. So we're going to look at tree cover, and what you can see is I've selected it from the drop-down menu, and we've got the darker orange areas indicating the highest amounts of tree cover. I've changed the year here to 1986, so you can see what the tree cover looked like at our earliest stage of this product. Now we can zoom in to specific areas of interest that we want to look at by using either the plus or minus signs on the left-hand side of the screen. You can also use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out, or you can specifically type in a location of interest. In this case, I put in Alvord, Texas, because this is right beside the Lyndon B. Johnson National Grassland area. And so that's where we're zoomed in right now. We're looking at the tree cover for that area in 1986. Now we can compare this to a different time period. So let's compare it to 2022. And you can see quite easily the amount of infilling and also expansion that's happened in terms of woody cover between the first and last years of our wrap data set in this region. Now you might want specific numbers. Instead of just visually looking at this, you might want to know how these trends change through time. So what you can do is, in this white box, you can click either draw features or upload a shapefile. So you can upload a specific shapefile of an area that you are interested in, but we're going to focus specifically on draw features for simplicity. And so if I click on draw features, I can use my mouse to draw a square. Once I complete that shape, what's going to happen is I have this white box pop up on the right-hand side. And this is going to show me trends in cover through time, as well as these blue bars looking at annual precipitation. So let's just zoom in on this a little bit. What you can see when we look through this is if you look at the dark orange line, that represents tree cover, and you can see we have increasing tree cover through time. When we compare that to the dark green line, which is perennial forbs and grasses, you can see in this area we have declining perennial forbs and grasses through time. So again, this is a summary of all of the data that is within my box. You can also look at annual biomass and 16-day biomass. If you look up top here, we have 3 tabs. Right now we're in the cover tab, but you can also look at biomass or 16-day biomass summary plots. And if you want all of the raw data, so you might want to make your own plots specifically with the wrap, you can export that information by clicking on the Save CSV or Save Excel file here on the left-hand side. And that'll export a summary of all of the information in the shapefile or the box or shape that you've drawn. And so this is an example of what the Excel spreadsheet would look like. You've got year, you have your different functional group types. So annual forbs and grasses, perennial forbs and grasses, shrubs, trees, litter, and bare ground. And then it also gives you a summary of annual precipitation and temperature for you to use as well. Now, you might want to conduct more advanced spatial analyses with the wrap as well, instead of just using these raw values. Perhaps you're interested in manipulating the underlying raster files, which is the type of file that the wrap comes in, this gridded file. And so that can be done by exporting the wrap using Google Earth Engine. Google Earth Engine, if people aren't familiar, it can be a little bit daunting since it has its own coding language to use, but you can find a link to code for Google Earth Engine that specifically tells you line by line how to extract the data that you're interested in using Google Earth Engine from the wrap. So in order to find all of those instructions and the code that you can just input your area of interest into and pull out the data, you can go to, on the Rangeland Analysis Platform website, you go to support, how to use the wrap, and then you go to processing wrap data in Google Earth Engine. And that's where you'll find instructions as well as that sample code that you can use. So how can we actually apply the wrap? I want to go through just a couple examples of how we've used the wrap in some of our research that might give you some suggestions on how you could use it in the future. So this is a study that was conducted by Dr. Fogarty, who's going to be speaking next. And what he was looking at, or what we all the authors were interested in looking at, was tracking changes in woody cover through time across Nebraska, but more specifically the conservation landscapes within Nebraska, where we're kind of targeting a lot of management for grassland areas. And so in this map, what's been done is we've taken the difference between the percent woody cover that occurred in 2000 versus 2017 for every pixel within the wrap between those 2 years. So we've subtracted them. And basically what that gave us is all of the red areas are areas where we saw an increase in woody cover between 2000 and 2017. All of the yellow areas are areas where we saw no change. And all the blue areas are where we saw a decline in woody cover through time. And so you can see that we've had a lot of woody expansion across Nebraska, which is easily visualized with this wrap data. We also extracted those raw values that I showed you in my demonstration of how to use the wrap. We extracted those temporal values and converted the percent cover to hectares. And then we tracked trends in woody cover in hectares through time for each one of these conservation landscapes of interest. So all of these black areas outlined in the map here are different conservation lands. Their labels are beside or within them. And you can see that the majority of these conservation lands are experiencing increases in woody cover through time overall. Dr. Fogarty also zoomed in to look at specific landscapes of interest to try to track the outcomes of management using the wrap and this approach. And so we zoom in here to the Les Canyons of Nebraska, which has been experiencing a large amount of woody encroachment from eastern red cedar. But land managers in this area are applying these high intensity burns to try to control and reverse woody encroachment. And so all of these black outlines here are all areas where they've applied prescribed fires. And we're looking to see the effectiveness of these fires. And so what you can see is that we have a lot of blue in these prescribed fire areas. So we're seeing that tree covers declined within a number of those prescribed fires. And we're also seeing that a lot of these prescribed fires are staying yellow, even though the surrounding areas are turning red. And so we're seeing that these fires have been effective at preventing woody encroachment into their perimeters. When we tracked through time, the changes in tree cover relative to year, what we found is we see this shift from this increasing trend to more of a plateau in tree cover. And this aligns with when they started applying a lot of these fires. And so you can see that we can track at this larger scale with the RAP the effectiveness of these fires at altering trends in tree cover on this landscape. Another study that I want to touch on quickly is one that I conducted with co-authors, tracking the response of vegetation to large wildfires in the Great Plains. And to do this, we used RAP data. And so what we did in this plot you can see here, we're looking at mean tree cover, percent tree cover through time within wildfire perimeters relative to time since fire. So everything before this red bar is the vegetation cover values that we saw, specifically here, tree cover before the fire occurred. And then the red bar is the year that wildfires happened. And then after the red bar, we're looking at vegetation response or recovery to that wildfire. Here we've summarized information for the Northwestern Great Plains ecoregion. So we're looking at a really large scale and we're summarizing information for a number of different wildfires. And you can see that after the wildfire, we see kind of this persistent decline in tree cover in this ecoregion, which showed that the tree cover in that area was sensitive to these wildfires. We can conduct the same type of analysis at a number of different scales. So this next plot is looking at the Ash Creek wildfire that occurred in 2012. So we're looking at, we summarized all of the tree cover information across that entire wildfire. And then this bottom plot here is looking at local information. So an individual pixel, one of those 30 by 30 meter squares, and we're tracking tree cover within the wildfire perimeter. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is not because I think, we should just light a bunch of wildfires to get rid of trees, but rather this shows you a way that we can track the response of treatments, the response of vegetation to specific treatments. So we can use this same type of approach with the RAP to look at, for instance, herbicide application, or we could look at mechanical removal or interactions between grazing and prescribed fire. So this is another way where we can track management or treatment outcomes using the RAP. So next, I just kind of want to talk about how to recognize and understand some of the limitations of the RAP. So the RAP is going to function best at larger scales and over longer temporal windows. And to understand this, I want to go into a little bit of how these types of data sets are created, these types of classifications, large-scale classifications from remotely sensed information. This is going to be a very simplistic explanation, but I think it helps give an idea it helps people to understand why there are some limitations with these data sets. So when we're creating a classification like this using satellite data and remotely sensed imagery, what we first do is we go out into the field and we collect field data of interest for a classification. So let's say we're looking specifically at grass cover in this instance. We're going to go out in the field and we're going to collect information on grass cover that we can use as a reference point for the satellite data. So this map here is looking at all of the different field sites that were used as references to train a model to create our classification for satellite data. And so you can see all these green points and all these stars are what was used across the Western US to generate the RAP. All of those were field sites. And what we do is we take the location of these field sites and we overlay that location with our satellite imagery. And we can say, okay, within this location, this is how much cover we have. And so this is what the reflectance signature in the satellite imagery or the remote sensing data, this is what that looks like. And we can do that over and over and over again for all our field sites. And basically we're telling the computer to create a rule that gives us a reflectance signature from that satellite imagery that says, okay, this is 20% grass cover. And we do this over and over with all of our data sets until the computer can create a model that with a low amount of error that tells us, okay, this is what we project cover would be across a landscape. And so all of this to say, well, actually first, I want to say this is extremely simplistic. So there were a number of different elements, additional elements that would have gone into creating the RAP, including different environmental variables and climate, but it gives you an idea of how these things are generated. So you can understand that there's a model that's basically being trained and then projecting this information across a larger area. And so inevitably there's going to be some error in these remotely sensed RAP products. So I want to go through some things that you might see that are a result of error rather than something on the ground. So one thing that you might see, for instance, is a conflict between your treatment and the timing of imagery. So in this graph, what you can see is we're looking at the response of our different functional group types from the RAP to a wildfire, the Ferguson fire that burned in 2011. The year of the fire is related to this red bar. And we would expect vegetation to decline during this time period, this red bar, but we see that it's actually happening a year afterward. And so what this is just a conflict between the timing of that treatment relative to the timing of how we took the imagery for our classification. So the imagery just wasn't able to detect that treatment or that change in vegetation until the following year. Another thing that you'll notice is there's a lot of variability created, particularly as we zoom into smaller scales. So in this case, you can see in the gray bar near the start of our time window, we see this jump between 20 to 30% cover. This isn't likely to be a true change in cover, but rather it's going to be a bit of error associated with just shifts in reflectance values in the data. So some of this variability, especially when we look at smaller scales, is not true. It's better to look at the overall trend that we're seeing rather than these small jumps in variability. And finally, specific numbers don't always line up. So as I mentioned, especially if you go into a smaller scale, you might say, well, in this location, I went out and measured 40% cover, but the RAP says it's 30% cover. The RAP numbers in a specific year in a specific location are not going to be exact. They're just model estimates. So I have had landowners come to me before and they're concerned because these numbers don't line up. So it's best to use the RAP when we're looking at over a larger scale, so we can average across some of those errors, or else we're looking at a longer temporal window so we can kind of reduce the amount of variability to see that longer trend. Finally, just really quickly, because I'm running out of time, I wanted to touch on the fact that there are other tools that have been developed based on the RAP that you can use as well. So this is an example of the Rangeland vulnerability to tree encroachment tool. And so this is hosted by Working Lands for Wildlife. And what they've done is they've created a classification using the RAP that tells you the locations that are in each one of those different phases of encroachment. So in green, we're looking at intact grasslands. In yellow, we're looking at grasslands that are in that phase of dispersal and recruitment. In dark red, maroon, we're looking at encroached areas. And then in gray, we're looking at areas that are forested already. And so you can use some of these tools, if a landowner is not specifically interested in trying to figure out where trees are spatially relative to them. And does that mean that they're in a dispersal and recruitment phase? Does that mean they're at risk soon? They can go to these types of tools and use them as well. So to access this tool, you can go to the Working Lands for Wildlife website, click on Science, click on Tools, Maps, and Apps. And then under the Tools heading, you'll go to Working Lands for Wildlife, or WLFW, Conservation Maps, and you can find these. They're in the same platform as the RAP, and so you can manipulate them in the same ways that I mentioned for the RAP itself. With that, I'd like to thank you so much. If I have any time left for questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, you're welcome to email me any questions that you have.
All right, thank you, Dr. Donovan. Looking at that last slide, it hurts my feelings a little bit seeing that the maroon means the encroached areas, but other than that, that's all right. So does anybody have any questions for Dr. Donovan?
Yes, may I ask a question, Erica, there?
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Parado, go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Donovan, first of all, amazing presentation. I really enjoyed all the information that you provided. Is it possible to download the information you just presented from the conservation maps the same way we can download the RAP data?
You know what? Actually, I am not sure if you can download it. Are you talking about through Google Earth Engine?
Either way, because it's possible to download all the images from the RAP and have them locally. I was just wondering if that same process was possible with the conservation maps.
I might actually tap Dr. Fogarty, who is more familiar with those new products. He actually enlightened me on them just recently. Dillon, do you know the answer to that question?
Yeah, so those maps are all map derivatives from the RAP, and they actually just transitioned them from the RAP platform to this Working Lands for Wildlife conservation map platform. Right now, they're not downloadable like the RAP data is, but that's a functionality that they're working to build in.
Okay, thank you. One more question, Dr. Donovan, or one request. Would it be possible to put the bibliography that you just shared with us, all those papers that you showed, if you could share them, the references could be shared with the group. I think those are amazing resources for everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk to Erica about getting all of those distributed to everyone.
Yes, and we have been dropping stuff in the chat at the same time. So the risk and vulnerability guide and some of the links to the conservation maps as well. But, in a follow-up email after this event, we can for sure, attach some of these documents and links.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Donovan. Okay. So Dr. Fogarty, are you ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. So feel free to share your screen.
Hey, Erica, could you pose that question to the group again that you did before Tori's session? I thought that was a really good way to kind of frame the presentations today.
Absolutely. So the question that I asked, if you weren't here earlier on, is how can we use the latest resources and tools available to manage and prevent woody species from spreading?
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's just a really good way to frame these talks. And with integrating the new tech, I mean, when the RAP came out, I think it was 2018, it really revolutionized the way we can look at rangelands and learn about woody encroachment. I was a PhD student at the time, and it allowed us to really take a deep dive into, what the state of our rangelands is in the Great Plains and in Nebraska, where I completed my PhD. But also look at our management practices, going back to 1986 or whenever we, decide to use that baseline year. In Nebraska, we weren't managing woody encroachment in 1986. We started in the mid-2000s. But it's really allowed us to go through this rapid learning period where we've been able to figure out what's worked, what hasn't worked. And with that's come a series of publications, some of which Dr. Donovan talked about. We have a new extension guide out that really lays a new philosophy and a game plan for tackling encroachment. And then what we actually have coming is a new pocket guide that really takes this new philosophy for managing woody encroachment and integrates it with a planning process for implementing conservation investments in rangelands. That product's actually coming out in July. It's going to be launched at the Working Lands for Wildlife conference in Manhattan. Some of the content in that pocket guide I'm going to give a little sneak peek to today. And so I just wanted to thank my co-authors, Treadwell, Morgan Treadwell, Carol Baldwin, Laura Goodman, Allison Thompson, Pete Bauman, and Doug Cram, as well as some of the NRCS collaborators that really invested a lot of time and gave us great feedback in the development of this guide. So Doug Spencer with Kansas, Brandon Rivas in Oklahoma, Jeff Nichols in Nebraska, and Emily Helms in South Dakota. And additionally, we had feedback from the rest of our extension team in the Great Plains. So thanks in advance to those folks. Before I dive into production losses, one of the big ideas that's come from being able to look across our rangelands at multiple points in time is, where should we work versus where do we work? And so we've had this realization that if we're going to conserve Great Plains grasslands, we need to really think about where we're prioritizing where we work. And that's because woody encroachment has been outpacing our management. And so I actually posed this question at a youth range camp last week, and it got some really great answers. But so one of the responses was, we should work on this hillside. And that's kind of the traditional, that really emphasizes traditional brush management. We went to where the problem was and we put our investments there, kind of with the idea that, we can go in and reverse the problem in these landscapes and set them back to a grassland state. Which we've, of course, learned over the years and through lots of research that doesn't actually happen. We actually have rapid re-encroachment if we do that. And it takes a lot more effort and energy with a lot less likelihood of being success if we focus on these hillsides. Some of the other answers, though, were at your feet, focus in the grass and manage that dispersal zone where you have seeds and seedlings coming off of the hillside into the intact grassland. And then my favorite answer, I think, from the day was, you just manage all of it. You can use the prescribed fire to manage everything in that photo. And this was a group of 14 to 18-year-olds. But it really does emphasize kind of this challenge and this shift from, how do we go from, we've had decades of prioritizing the red or these infested areas, and now we're really flipping that model to starting in our intact grasslands and working towards the problem. And so the challenge, right, is one of the challenges, is where there's demand to work with producers that want to engage in brush management or prescribed fire or managing woody encroachment, versus where the best opportunities are for proactive, cost-effective management on the landscape. Traditionally, this landscape gets prioritized. There's more demand for brush management contracts, whereas this landscape is on the front lines of the problem. It's one of our best opportunities for stabilizing our grassland resources, but it's more of a challenge to oftentimes to work in places like this. They haven't experienced the level of impacts that other landscapes have. And so why do we care about woody encroachment? Dr. Donovan talked about the impacts. This is long-term data from Sonora Research Station, published by Dr. Fuhlendorf, and it shows the collapse of livestock production as we go from a grassland to a juniper woodland. This is a universal impact that occurs across Great Plains grasslands. We have different juniper species, follows the same general trend where we have this collapse in grassland resources. From the social side, we kind of go through this, I'll say, denial, where when we're up here, we see a lot of attitudes that it won't happen to me, that these grasslands are not susceptible to woody encroachment, whether that's climate, soil, or just a lack of trees. However, by the time we get to, 30, 20, 10% cover, and we're starting to see significant impacts on the landscape, we're really wishing we could go back and do things differently. And so that's where I want to bring our attention to production losses to woody encroachment in this new tool that I think can be really effective for engaging producers early on in the encroachment process and encouraging early adoption. So in 2019, the Great Plains lost 22.4 million tons of forage production to woody encroachment. I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so kind of going over this new tool and how I think we can use it. So I'm going to jump. And Erica, can you just please confirm that we're still sharing?
Yes, you are still sharing. It looks good. I'm seeing the rangeland production loss to tree encroachment right now.
Perfect. So let me put this in the chat. So feel free to go along with me. This is public site. Anyone can go to. But it's like I said about some of the other products, it's a wrap derivative. So it uses data from the Rangeland Analysis Platform, and it goes in and it takes tree cover and it looks at production losses across Western US rangelands. And so I'm just going to walk through kind of this homepage and what we can do here. Highlight production losses from 2019, as well as cumulative production losses. We have, the home screen shows west-wide impacts. And then within this map, we can zoom in on states. We can look at Texas lost in 2019, over 14 million tons of production to woody encroachment. And then if we're a county extension agent or working at the county level, we can zoom in on a different county. So if we look at Nolan County, 81,000 tons of production loss in 2019. So we can do that for every county. In addition to just the reporting, we have these really nice graphs showing production losses since 1990. And so one of the things about this data is the way production losses are calculated, and they have supporting information. So I want to kind of direct your information or your attention to those areas on the site too. But they use a 1990 baseline. And then from that year, so they assume, so production losses are calculated based on increasing tree cover since that 1990 baseline. And what they calculate is a yield gap. So yield gap is much more common in cropland agriculture. We don't use the term as much in rangelands, but it's an effective way to think about how things like woody encroachment are decreasing yield in our rangelands. So you can see here we have a 1990 baseline. That's when achievable production and observed production were coupled for this model. Then we have changes in year-to-year precipitation, temperature. That drives some of this variability. The model can account for that. So what we see, the difference here driven between achievable and observed, they're able to parse that out, that it is the result of increasing tree cover, which creates a yield gap in our rangelands. Some of the other metrics that are reported, so we have rangeland production in 2019, production losses, cumulative rangeland production losses, tree cover change, and percent tree cover. For whatever kind of level we're dialed into, whether that's Western US rangelands, Texas, or the county level, we can download that data. It's really quick. And we can get a CSV data frame tracking us, going all the way back to 1990 to 2019. This will be 2019 is the latest year in the model. It will get updated in the next year or two. But we have total area, analysis area. I'll talk about that in a minute. Biomass produced, again, that's going to be in tons. Yield gap, that's production lost due to woody encroachment, again, in tons. Tree cover and then tree area, that's going to be in acres. The other thing I wanted to bring your attention to is the analysis area. Again, I said we're using that 1990 baseline, but the model is also accounting for, it's excluding, I should say, error that might be coming from water bodies, cities, agricultural lands, and then historically forested areas. And so you can actually see in green the analysis area that's used in that analysis. If we zoom in on a county, we can get that analysis area to see which areas were excluded from that analysis. The other thing I'll touch on is building slides. One of the features they did here is we can, oh, I spoke too soon. We can take these charts and we can copy them. And what you're going to get is a really actually high quality image that you can insert into PowerPoint slides. And so jumping back to mine, this is just, largely screenshots and copying, pasting figures from the page to create kind of a boilerplate county level production loss slide, which I've used in a lot of my talks to engage producers. I'll note too that Friday of this week, we're going to have our first fact sheet produced from the Great Plains Grassland Extension Partnership that will feature production losses to woody encroachment. And so we take this data and we break it into more interpretable metrics, like if we took that 22.4 million tons, how many round bales would that be? What's the economic value if we, based on cash rental rates, or how many cows could we support, or how much feed would that, or how that would feed how many cows for a year. So anyway, that'll be coming out this Friday. I'll be in contact with Morgan, who's a co-author, and Erica to help get that distributed. Want to talk a little bit about motivating conservation action and at least how I've done that in some of my work. So right here we have, I just pulled these randomly from different counties, states, and levels in the Great Plains. But what we see is this consistency in production loss trends to woody encroachment. I said earlier that this pattern is consistent across rangelands. We have different woody species driving it, but this is kind of what we see is this collapse of forage resources. So when we look at empirical data, we see those same trends. I think this is really powerful for motivating early action in places where they might not really be focusing on the threat of woody encroachment because they're in the early stages is we can encourage people to learn from counties or places in the Great Plains that have been dealing with it for a lot longer. And so, for example, this is Knox County, Nebraska. If we look at this trend in production losses, we can safely say they should have been managing woody encroachment in 1996. But they more than likely were not managing at that point. And today they've lost over 20,000 tons of production losses. If we look at Wheeler County, that's on the edge of the Sandhills, one of the largest intact grassland regions remaining in the world. They've had more recent losses in rangeland production. So in 2015, they started to see county-wide production losses. Well, Wheeler County looks like Knox County did in 1996. It'd be nice if they could go back in Knox County and do things differently in 1996 versus today. Wheeler County has that opportunity today. And so we've used this kind of encouragement from, it's almost like hindsight, but it's coming from a different place, to encourage people to be more proactive and, do what Knox County wishes they could go back and do in 1996 and do that today in Wheeler County. If we look at Texas, I just wanted to kind of walk through a little bit. If we look at Jack County, I mean, with the 1990 baseline, they, at minimum, we can argue that they should have been managing woody encroachment in the early 90s if they weren't already. Today, they've lost almost 200,000 tons of production to woody encroachment. We move west to Haskell County. Same trend, they're not as far along. They started seeing production losses around the early 2000s. As we keep moving west, again, I bet in Jack County they would have loved to go back and start doing things differently when they had production losses right around 1,000 tons at the county level. And so it provides that tool to help communicate that aspect with producers. All right. Let me jump back to my slides. Any questions there? I've got more, but I'm going to switch gears a little bit. All right, we'll keep cruising.
Yep, I don't see anything in the chat, Dr. Fogarty, so keep on cruising.
All right. So if we can convince people or excite them about getting ahead of this problem in the early stages, one of the things we're working to do and we're encouraging with new guidelines for managing woody encroachment is seeing the problem in a different light or through a different lens. So rather than thinking about this from the perspective of woody cover or where we have high woody cover on the landscape, we're encouraging people to look at the problem through a risk lens. So this is from the Sandhills, Nebraska. We have a single seed producing tree. The typical response in this area would have been, we don't have a problem. But what we know, based on research that we've conducted in this region, is that this tree is loaded with seeds that are dispersed. 95% of seed dispersal and recruitment is occurring within 200 yards of that tree.
Hey, Dillon.
Yes.
You got a question in the chat. Is there a time where it would be too late to start, such as places that are already red? Would there be any point in trying? What's your opinion on that?
That's a great question. Absolutely. It changes this. My opinion is that it changes the scale at which we're implementing new guidance. So at the Great Plains level, we might be targeting some of our most intact ecoregions that are left. But when within an encroached county, we're really looking at where are those last areas of grasslands that we can prioritize to work in. Or if you're a property owner, if you can prioritize those best areas on your place and work out from there. And I've actually got some examples at the end that'll touch on how different groups are operationalizing this in different landscapes, including ones that are highly infested.
Thank you, Dillon.
Yeah. Oops. So one of the things we're encouraging is, instead of seeing this as not a problem, or, I mean, this landscape wouldn't have qualified for cost share for brush management historically. What we're encouraging people to see now is a contaminated landscape. One seed-bearing tree in a landscape like this contaminates 26 acres of grassland around it with seed and seedling recruitment. And so in this landscape, we pose the question, is this landscape mostly intact, mostly contaminated by seed and seedlings, or is it mostly infested? I think one of the common responses we would get is intact, when in fact, if we look at the contamination zones from these individual trees, we see that the landscapes, it's contaminated. It's minimally intact because of those isolated seed sources. And so if we can encourage private lands biologists, land managers, scientists to start seeing the problem differently, I think that's going to be key for operationalizing. Like Erica posed in her question, how can we prevent the spread of woody plants? I think that starts with, kind of changing our perception of how we view woody encroachment and looking at it from a risk perspective. In this landscape, rather than focusing on the infestation, thinking of it as a source of contamination to the surrounding grasslands around it. How am I doing on time? Okay. What I want to do now is transition into some real world examples of how this guidance has been adopted and is being implemented on private lands in the Great Plains. And so first I'm going to start with the Les Canyons. Dr. Donovan talked about that a little bit. But one of the new recommendations that we're encouraging is, when you're putting a plan together, when you're mapping encroachment on your place, talk to your neighbors. Think about how we can come together and work with our neighbors to manage encroachment. This map shows a landowner network. It's 2 prescribed burn associations in Nebraska's Les Canyons region. We actually put this map together for them over the last 2 years, but it shows their membership footprint, and it shows where they have the cultural will to manage the problem. And so since 2005, they've been able to grow cultural will in their region, and now they dominate. I mean, I think they have 265,000 acres that their membership owns and manages within a 300,000 acre ecoregion. And so what that allows them to do is, they have individual burn units that cover across 5 to, I think, up to 10 properties with a single burn. So that allows them to structure their management plans around the biology of the problem rather than property lines. And so what we've seen in this landscape is that they've been able to halt the expansion of woody plants. The only landscape in Nebraska that we see where we see that happening. The other thing that they're doing in this landscape is, instead of using different tools for different stages of the encroachment process, which can really complicate a management plan, they've specialized in the use of high intensity fire, kind of emphasized in this photo. So they've brought their neighbors together, they're managing as a community, and they're adopting the use of high intensity fire so they can defend intact grasslands, they can manage the dispersal and recruitment zone, they can collapse sparse seed sources, and they collapse 85% of the woody dominated areas on average with their burns. The challenge will be then getting in to get the 15% that serves as a seed source after the fire, which is one of the things they're working on right now. But that's one example. When I was talking at Range Camp last week, the student who said, well, we could just manage it all, he's actually from the Les Canyons landscape. And so that's definitely their attitude in this area. Then we have coming to Oklahoma, now the Arbuckle Mountains region, we have Defend the Core, Grow the Core being operationalized in an infested landscape. So this is a really good, it speaks to that question we had earlier about, are some landscapes just so infested that there's no point in working in them? This is one of the most highly infested landscapes in Oklahoma, but we still have places like this. So this is the Double C Cow Company, and they have the last remaining grassland cores in the Arbuckle region. They're working to defend those cores and then grow them over time. So by prioritizing those intact grasslands and then working on the boundaries to prevent the problem from encroaching into those intact areas, they're able to maintain those areas, and then they can be opportunistic. So if a wildfire were to occur in this landscape, they could use that as an opportunity to potentially grow and connect their cores over time.
Hey, Dillon, going back to your land ownership maps, where were you able to get those, and could you share where you did get them?
Yeah, absolutely. We created these using membership maps, and then we used a mapping software. It's actually commonly used for hunting, but it maps out property ownership, which is public information, and we use that software to create these landowner maps.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. But it's one thing that, we've talked to other groups, and every time we show this map, there seems like there's interest in expanding on this approach. In some places, the landowners have, that information where they can create smaller versions of this map on their own. Other times that's more difficult. Another example, this is in the Sandhills, on the Cooksley Ranch. We have the Cooksley family who have a largely intact 21,000 acre ranch. They work very hard to keep the problem off of their ranch. One of the problematic areas on their property where they had a neighbor's infestation coming right up to the fence line. And so they were required to constantly work on this area to defend that boundary. In 2020, we had a workshop with Barb and the community, and talked about the big picture of woody encroachment and what are the risks to the Sandhills and their communities in general. And after the meeting, the landowner on the other side of the fence, her neighbor, went in and cleared that 200 200-yard area from the fence line. So it took the pressure off the Cooksley's ranch. And so a great example of, neighbors working together to take pressure off of their neighbors. Another example from the Sandhills, but this could be applied at other places. In some of our most intact areas, I talked about the challenge of working in those areas. One of the other challenges is those areas are targeted for windbreaks, for tree plantings that actually start to become the dominant seed source in those landscapes. And so what we've seen with Nebraska NRCS, as well as other conservation partners like the Sandhills Task Force, a landowner-led organization in the Sandhills, is that they'll come in and offer cost share for removing unnecessary windbreaks, which is a big deal. When I talked about one tree can contaminate up to 26 acres on a landscape, being able to remove these windbreaks that are no longer needed is a really big deal for reducing risk in these landscapes. We have defend the core, grow the core across private property. So what we have here is Halsey National Forest. This is the largest hand-planted forest in the United States. It sits in the most intact grassland region in the world, the Sandhills. And what we have here is a plan between the U.S. Forest Service and surrounding landowners to contain the threat of encroachment. So they're actually establishing a core area around this hand-planted forest and then using prescribed fire to contain the threat of encroachment. And so they've been able to establish, their tens of thousand acres of core have been established in this perimeter area that they're going to use as kind of a donut buffer zone around that forest to protect the surrounding private lands. One of the big things here is with this approach, they flipped the model to focusing on their best grasslands first. They've been able to get contracts to come in and manage 10,000 acres at $1 to $2 per acre when they're managing that really low density of woody cover. Last example I have, this is from the Gypsum Hills in southern Kansas, where we had in 2016, the 400,000 acre Anderson Creek wildfire came in and really knocked back woody encroachment in this region and gave the community an opportunity to really take advantage of what would have been an incredible effort through brush management or prescribed fire. Really reduced the level of encroachment in this area. And so what they're doing now is coming together as a community. It's hard to see, but we have a property network that they've identified in this landscape that they're going to use to establish these core areas. So the idea is establish these cores. So they're getting in, they're getting after the 1 to 2 to 15% of seed sources that were able to survive the fire. They're getting those seed sources knocked out, and then they're getting in with prescribed fire or other tools to eliminate the seed and seedlings that are coming back after the fire. So their approach here is to get ahead of, to take advantage of what that wildfire did and use it as an opportunity to establish some large grassland cores in a landscape that, this scale of core building would have been unrealistic a couple of years ago. So those are some examples, kind of how the guidance has been used. I'm happy to take questions. I have also got some links here for some of the tools that we looked at today.
All right, thank you, Dr. Fogarty. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Fogarty before we move on?
Yes, Eric, I have a question.
All right, go ahead, Dr. Parado.
This is a really interesting presentation, and I'm a little bit I don't know. This question has to do with having some brush in the landscape because of climate change. I think this is great when you are dealing with probably just livestock, but what when you have a multi-use of the landscapes and you want to have wildlife and livestock? And we are seeing that with climate change, temperatures are rising, and the thresholds for bob whites and things like that is being affected. So this is more impactful in the south. So how do you see this tool being adapted to be able to manage that as well?
Yeah, great question. I would say that throughout Great Plains rangelands, there's a handful of species that are capable of causing large-scale transitions from grass to a woody dominated state. And so really we're focusing on the most problematic or species that are capable of really collapsing grassland resources. Whereas other shrubby species that might be more of a native component or a permanent fixture on the landscape, taking different approaches to those species management. We talk about maybe reducing those species or even manipulating them, but not necessarily removing them from the landscape. So with removal, we've really focused on some of these species that can cause, that drive the most detrimental consequences in rangelands, and that can completely cause a shift. And so I guess, does that get at your question?
Yeah, one of the concerns I have about RAP, and I mean, RAP, I think RAP is an amazing tool, but it does not separate or differentiate between species. And that's normal, that's understandable. The resolution of the platform and all that does not allow for that to happen. But what we're seeing in South Texas is that there is brush and there is brush, and so we can have some really nice diverse Tamaulipan thorn scrub that is very functional from the perspective of wildlife. And then we can have areas that have been manipulated, and then the growth comes as aggressive mesquite everywhere. And that's exactly what we're seeing, what you described here in your presentation. So I'm just thinking about how these can be used in the future to kind of make a little bit more of that separation.
Yeah, and we have those species that we want to totally remove from the landscape, and then we have, like you mentioned, other species that have a place on the landscape, like ponderosa pine, oak, sagebrush, plenty of woody species that can coexist in these grassy ecosystems. One of the things we emphasize in the new pocket guide that'll be coming out next month is you take this RAP data, or the RAP derived products that Dr. Donovan showed, and that's the first step. That's an initial map, but then we need to do, we need to correct the map with field inventory. So RAP's really powerful, allows us to go back in time. It can be that initial map, but it really needs to be used in tandem with on the ground knowledge to incorporate the species level information. So identifying those areas that aren't actually sources of infestation, that they might be an oak savanna or a more desirable woody community. So I totally agree.
Dillon, I have kind of a quick question, since most of our participants are from Texas. How far ahead would you say Texas systems in general are compared to our other Great Plains states in terms of encroachment? Are we 50 years ahead of y'all, 100 years? What kind of temporal timeline would you give us?
Gosh, I think it depends on probably where you're at in Texas, but I think probably 50+ years to some counties being in the same boat as other places in the Great Plains.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, especially when we look at the wrap from north to south across the Great Plains, you can definitely see where the brush is coming from and where it's moving toward. And so if we can be a lessons learned epicenter for other grassland states, I think that there's a lot of power in that, in telling the story of what conversion has looked like in Texas over the last 100 years or so, 150 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, does anybody have any other questions for Dr. Fogarty? Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. Oh, that's my email. Let's not look at that. Okay.
Yep, we've got your slides, Erica. They look good.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate it. All right. Howdy, y'all. So my name is Erica Sullivan. I'm a master's student at Texas A&M University, and the title of my talk is Rangeland Analysis Platform Training. So we might be seeing some of the same stuff that we saw from Tori's presentation, except I'm going to try and fill in the blanks a little bit more in some areas that maybe she didn't touch upon. So something that I really wanted to cover as well is, as part of my master's research, I'm studying the attitudes and perceptions of multiple different age groups. So I'm looking at 4-H kids, I'm looking at, high school FFA kids, I'm looking at Texas Master Naturalists. I think I actually have some here from my project on this call, as well as landowners. So I'm studying their attitudes and perceptions when it comes to woody plant encroachment and tools such as prescribed fire, multi-species grazing, and pyrrhic herbivory. And so I've developed my own teaching curriculum to teach on these different topics in order to try and either better equip these folks to manage and deal with woody plant encroachment, or even just spread the knowledge that's out there currently. And so we'll kind of dive a little bit more into this talk, as well as how extension agents are now using this platform to help teach about these different issues. And so what I'll touch upon first is a little bit more on the Prairie Project. How was this nonprofit involved in spreading extension knowledge on these different topics? And then I'll touch briefly upon woody plant encroachment again, but then get more into the different treatments that we can use for these different issues, what's been shown to be effective in combating this issue. Then we'll dive into a brief Rangeland Analysis Platform tutorial, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit more, what exactly we're looking at. And then I'll talk about some of the fact sheets and publications that will be coming out. So if you are an extension agent, an educator, or someone who you work with different 4-H or FFA groups, there's going to be future publications available for you to teach these different groups about this topic and the management techniques that they can use. So very exciting stuff. All right, so what exactly is the Prairie Project? That is a really phenomenal question there. So to begin, we're a nonprofit. We are funded by the USDA NIFA program in Sustainable Agriculture Systems. But really, we are a collaboration among research, teaching, and extension faculty from Texas A&M University, Oklahoma State University, and University of Nebraska. And we are all dedicated towards the same mission. Let's get the knowledge out there to extension agents, to educators on the different techniques of prescribed fire, multi-species grazing, and pyrrhic herbivory or patch burn grazing. And our ultimate goal together is to maintain and increase livestock production while providing the vital ecosystem services that the Southern Great Plains provide. So we've talked a lot about woody plant encroachment already. I know we're talking about just here in Texas, some of the species that we're dealing with are honey mesquite, eastern red cedar, ash juniper as well. Really pesky plants. But the causes of, woody plant encroachment can be attributed to multiple different things. So historic and current overgrazing, climate variability and extremes, ornamental plantings as well, natural fire regime disruption, and a loss of the herbivores and browsers throughout the Southwestern Great Plains ecosystem. And those really helped, a combination of fire and herbivores is what really helped to keep these, woody plant species in check. So prescribed fire, the controlled application of fire to an area in order to meet landowner objectives. Prescribed fire, when it's done, it's most effective when fuel loads are abundant and woody plant species are in their most vulnerable stage as a seedling or small sapling. They're going to have more impact on plants when they're young versus when they're old and it's a mature tree. But when it's done correctly under the right conditions, it can offer a cost-effective solution to prevent the seedling recruitment and sapling maturation of these woody plants. And I know Dillon, he talked about prescribed burn associations earlier. So if you are someone who, maybe you own 80 acres, maybe you own 1,000, but you are someone who is interested in using the techniques of prescribed fire and you don't know how to get started, I highly recommend reaching out to your local prescribed burn associations. More likely than not, they'll have some kind of opportunity for you to maybe even participate in a brush pile burn or maybe even participate in a small 10-acre burn. But it's a really good place to get started. So multi-species grazing. Multi-species grazing is when you graze one or more species of herbivore together. And so in this case, I'm talking about the most effective way to multi-species graze when it comes to woody plants is adding goats to your cattle herds or goats and sheep to your cattle herds. And what this does is it mimics historic use of these rangelands and it increases the use of woody plants. As we know, goats will eat anything. And when I say anything, I mean, they really like to eat those woody plants. And so what this does when you graze these two different species together is, well, for one, it can increase your carrying capacity. We have studies out there that show adding sheep to cattle herds versus just, grazing cattle alone can increase that carrying capacity up to 24%. And this can increase your economic returns 20 to 25%. Improved cash flow, we can kind of lump that in with economic returns, but when you have these two species together, well, now you're marketing two different products at the same time. And we know that markets have their highs, they have their lows. Cattle might be good one year, goats might not be good the next year, and that might flip-flop on you, but you got two different species, so you still got some profit income. Improved animal performance. So you run some of these same species together, goats and cattle, you can actually reduce the parasite load occurring on your lands, reduce disease transmission, and you can also improve your land condition. When you graze goats, sheep, and cattle together, cattle are going to be a lot less picky, whereas your goats and sheep a little bit more picky. But running these animals together, well, you're utilizing the grasses in a different way, creating different patches of variability, and this is great for wildlife as well as parasite load and things like that. Okay, so the next one I want to touch upon, if you're not aware of this practice, but emerging research in the application of fire and grazing together have been shown to be effective in combating the woody plant encroachment. And so if you don't know what patch burn grazing is, it uses a combination of prescribed fire and herbivores, so I'm talking cattle or goats, to create a mosaic of newly burned, recently burned, and unburned areas. And so I have a picture to the bottom right that shows an example rotation. What does this kind of look like if you're applying it onto your land? And so let's say you want a burn interval of 3 years. So how you would break that down is, well, year one, I'm gonna burn one area. Year two, I'm gonna move my animals to a different area, burn that area. And year three, I'm gonna do the same thing. And so now you're creating that newly burned, recently burned, and unburned area. in your land, and it does a lot of the same things that multi-species grazing does. So you're reducing woody plant encroachment with the application of, browser and prescribed fire, increasing your forage quality. So when you burn these areas, the grass, I think it's the first, I want to say like 6 months or so, when it comes back, it's highly nutritious, highly palatable for your animals. In fact, your animals are going to be attracted to these recently burned areas. I wish I would attach, but there's a video from Oklahoma that there's a guy who's actively burning on his land, and the cattle are just sitting around waiting for the fire to go out, because they're ready for that new grass growth to pop back up. But increasing plant heterogeneity, improving your grazing distribution, can also improve your carrying capacity as well, because again, you burn these areas, grass comes back up, ready to eat for your cattle, your goats, your sheep. Okay, and so I know Tori kind of touched upon this a little bit more. We know that, so the RAP was developed as a collaboration between USDA, NRCS, Bureau of Land Management, and the University of Montana. And something that I just really want to talk about is that this platform is really user-friendly. So you don't need to have a background in ArcGIS in order to navigate this. In fact, if you are really good with Google Earth, I don't see that you'll have any issue with navigating this platform in general. And so what we're going to do next, and something that I want to talk about with y'all, is the Prairie Project is partnered up with 4 different demonstration ranches out here in West Texas. And all of these guys out here, they are practicing some form of prescribed fire grazing or good grazing management. And what they've done is they've allowed people to actually go onto their ranches. They'll give talks on how they've been conducting these techniques, what the impact has been from utilizing these techniques. And when participants get to go out there, and I've brought 4-H, I've brought FFA out there, they're blown away when they go and see that, oh wow, like this area, it looks great once these different techniques are applied. And so I have a short little activity. Well, this is if you want to follow along with me. And so we're going to make this complicated, or try not to, maybe try not to make this complicated, but we're actually I'm going to show you how to collect data on this specific ranch that actively does prescribed fire and patch burn grazing. And so I just dropped a web link in the chat that will take you to prairieproject.mailchimpsites.com, and we're going to download the shapefile for Hoover K Bar Ranch. And so Dr. Treadwell, let me know, does my screen show up here with RAP protocol materials?
Yeah, you've got the RAP on there with the High Lonesome and Big Valley pastures.
Oh no, the website.
Oh yes, your website's loaded into the chat.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to stop share real fast. Share. Okay, does this show up okay?
Yep, got it.
All right, so I'm going to go to number 4, ranch shapefiles, and I'm going to go to West Texas ranch shapefiles and download this Hoover K Bar polygons shapefile. And so click on download here. It's going to download as a zip file, and you're going to keep it as a zip file. So if you're working with shape files, you usually want to have it in a zip file. If you extract all the information, it's not going to load at all within the Rangeland Analysis Platform. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to the RAP website. All right, is the RAP website showing up okay?
Yep, got it.
All right, thank you. I'm going to click on upload shapefile. And there she is. I'm going to open this up. Okay. And so this is what everybody should see, once they upload their shapefile within the Rangeland Analysis Platform. If you were to click on each of these boxes, you see the name of each ranch. And so this one is Big Valley Pasture. It's been treated with a prescribed fire in 2018, and it's also been treated with goats and cattle. And so I developed my own curriculum just around these 4 different ranches within the Prairie Project. And we have participants go into this platform, and it's almost like they run a case study on these different pastures. They're trying to figure out what kind of impact is fire having on the different vegetation types found within this platform. And then they actually, they create hypotheses and they test those hypotheses within this platform. And so we'll focus on perennial forbidden grass. So if we look at, we know a fire ran through here in about 2018. So we look at 2017 through 2018 and 2019, we can kind of see how these different colors change, what the wrap is picking up in these different areas. So really cool visual information that you're getting, as well as the number data that we'll get here in a second. But we have participants collect data on cover, and we also have them collect data on biomass. So we see, okay, how has our pounds per acre changed in this one pasture that we know has been treated with fire and livestock? And so if we look at perennial forbidden grass, in this case, 2022, it's looking a little rough, but that's okay. Let's look at 2017, 2018, and 2019. So I maybe see a little bit more green in some areas, and participants would take note exactly of what they're seeing in this pasture, and maybe how fire could have influenced, some of what we're seeing here visually. And so if you want to put this in a mode that is not so black and white in the background, you can click on satellite mode here. And we'll go ahead and actually download the data for this pasture. And so if you click on draw features, you are automatically in drawing mode. So you're ready to draw a polygon in here. You start clicking on your screen. And so we're going to outline this area of interest. So Big Valley is my area of interest. So remember, when using this technology, that it's better to focus on larger areas than really small areas. And so that's what we're going to do. And so you should see another window pop up here. And it's going to show us some of the graphical representations that the wrap has for cover, for annual biomass, and 16-day biomass. And so looking at this pasture, I know I'm a more visual person, so I can actually open this graph up. It's right underneath the print button here. But we can see just how the vegetation types have changed over time, dating all the way back to 1986 in this case. And so what I can see is that, well, for one, we have a couple outliers here. I'm guessing these are big drought periods during 1989 and 1988, and also 2011. We see some steep drop-offs in 2011 of tree cover as well. And if we look around the time period of 2018, we know that there was a fire around this time. We can see, for one, rainfall was pretty high in 2018, so that could be an impact influencing, what exactly is happening with our vegetation. We also see that perennial forbidden grass is pretty high after 2018, which is something that I would expect after I run a prescribed fire through this area. If you want to clean this up a bit and only focus on perennial forbidden grass and maybe annual precipitation, you can just click on these different cover types here. And now you can actually see, all right, this is how perennial forbidden grass, this is the graph trend right here for this area. So really cool stuff. You can print out this map, take it out to the field with you, or even just hold on to it, see if your management practices have had any impact on your own ranch as well. And so what you can do for cover is download the CSV or Excel file data. So if you don't have Microsoft Office, you don't have Excel, what you can do is download it as a CSV. But that's assuming that you also have Google or Google Sheets. But in Google Sheets, you can actually upload CSV files into it. So that's another good option for you as well. But I'm going to show you how to download the Excel data for this pasture. I'm going to open this file, and I might have to stop sharing and reshare, but we'll see. Okay. All right, Dr. Treadwell, is this showing up okay?
Yes, we've got your Excel file.
All right, perfect. And so I know Tori showed y'all this earlier, but we're just going to focus on the years that we know a prescribed fire occurred in this pasture. So we're going to focus on, perennial foreign grass, shrub, tree, in bare ground for this area. And this is what participants would be looking at in my curriculum as well, is just how have these cover categories changed around the time that, either fire or grazing took place. And so taking all these, the visual data and the number data into consideration whenever they're coming up with a conclusion, is fire really having an impact here, or do we need closer inspection? And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of some of this here, but now we can look at these few years here, 2017 through 2019. If you focus on perennial foreign grass in this case, we can see that there is an upward trend in the amount of perennial foreign grass that we're getting. So that's a really good sign when you're looking at it. If we're looking at just shrub data, it's gone down a little bit, but it looks like it kind of peaked around 2019. And then tree as well, looks like we have a slow decline in trees, but then it picked back up again in 2022. And then if we look at bare grounds, so something that you can kind of maybe expect with prescribed fire sometimes is you get a little bit more bare ground in this case. So looking at 2017 to 2018, it looks like we got a little bit of a jump, but then it went back down, which is another really good sign that maybe, fire, or at least it can kind of clue us in that, yeah, something else did happen in this area that wasn't just rainfall involved. But the RAP will give us annual temperature and annual precipitation for this area. So just other things that, you can use for yourself. Okay. I'm going to close out of this. Don't save. And then this is probably going to be the last thing that I look at in the RAP here, but you can download the Excel and CSV file for annual biomass, as well as 16-day biomass for these different pastures. And so right now it is currently tracking the trend of pounds per acre in this pasture. Currently, right now it's going up, so that is a really good sign. Our rancher would be happy to see this for sure. All right, let me get back to my PowerPoint here. Okay.
Your slides look good, Erica.
All right, thank you. Okay, and so if you are looking for more resources, how do I build my own shapefile to upload within the Rangeland Analysis Platform without having to download maybe some software or use a website that you have to pay for? I've developed a short little video or demonstration on how you can create a shapefile using just Google Earth and free websites that are available to you. Now, let's say you're more interested in learning about the different calculations, how the RAP has come up with these different numbers. And there's a bunch of, equations and calculations that go behind this. It's over my head, but if you're someone who's interested in more of the analytical side of that, they have a user guide, but they also have a YouTube channel where they kind of give you the more in-depth dive into, how they actually computed all these different numbers. So all this will be available to you and be sent to you after this meeting takes place. Okay, so I've told you all that I've been working with participants, having them collect data in the RAP on these different ranches out in West Texas. Something else that we had them do is, okay, now that they've seen this RAP data, let's go out and conduct, different ground truthing techniques and collect some of the same data that the RAP shows us. And so we took participants out onto this same ranch, so Hoover K Bar, and we had them running tapes out there. And when I say participants, I'm talking they were Texas Master Naturalist folks. So we roped a couple of them into this, and I think they really enjoyed themselves. But I wanted to show y'all some of the data that they collected while they were out there. And so if we just focus on a Big Valley pasture here, so the blue is the on the ground data, whereas the orange is the RAP. data. So at least for this, what the RAP data gave us for grasses, is pretty high, 28.58. Shrubs, bare ground, and trees, it was all pretty much around the same percentage that we got. But when we look at the on the ground data, well, let's take a look at that for a second. So it looks like our most prominent cover type whenever we went out to this ranch, it was bare ground, whereas our second most prominent cover types were grasses. So grasses was second, and then shrubs were second. And so we'll kind of talk about that more in a couple slides from now, but just kind of keep that in mind. Why are we seeing such discrepancies, during comparing the RAT data to the on the ground data? Hold on, we're stuck. There we go. Another thing that they did, so we measured the mean distance of woody plants as well as the woody plant density on Big Valley pasture. And so the mean distance, so how far were these woody plants from one another, it was about 1.4 meters in the area that we're looking at in Big Valley where the fire was. And then for woody plant density, it was looking to be about 11% for this pasture. And just to kind of think about this a little bit more, you ask yourself a few questions. Why is the ground data not quite reflecting the RAP data that we have? And so I kind of misled y'all a little bit. Maybe we were comparing apples to oranges. The data that we collected on the ground, it was collected over the course of one day in the middle of, I believe it was July or August. And it was pretty hot time, hottest part of the summer probably. And so whenever we went out there for that day, the land, we haven't gotten a good rainfall in a while out there, but it's not that the RAP data was wrong. It's taking estimates over a long period of time versus just, we're out there for one day. But then I kind of wanted to ask y'all, is it more accurate to just ground truth over the course of a year versus just using the RAP? This is a really good question. So me personally, yeah, it probably would be more accurate to ground truth over the course of a year if you're running transects, every single day. But it's just when it comes down to it, how much time do you have? Most of us have busy lives. If we're not working out on the ranch, we have a job. And so whenever you use this type of technology, it can definitely be helpful when you're looking at these large areas. But I think something that we can take away from this technology is that maps are used to inform. They're not used to make decisions. So before using this type of technology, if you're trying to track or trying to see what your management practices have been doing over a period of time, first set that objective early on before you start using this technology. How is this technology going to, inform me? How am I going to use it? Just make sure that you're pretty set in what you're trying to accomplish by using this technology. But I still think it's a really great tool to use. I think that, it can also be a really good tool to use to teach as well and see the different practices or see the impacts of these different practices as well. Okay, so this is what really excites me. So we do have some more fact sheets and publications that will be coming out actually very soon. So something that we have coming out is a RAP curriculum. So if you are a teacher, if you are an educator, an extension agent who wants to use this technology to teach about prescribed fire, multi-species grazing, pyrrhic herbivory, teach about their impacts on these different rangelands, out in West Texas, they are more than able, this will be available to y'all to use. And it'll also be a video will kind of tie into that. It's like an introductory video. So, what is the Prairie Project, and how we're using this technology combined with 2 different ground truthing methods. So how you can use these 3 things together to help inform or make land management decisions, see the impacts of these different techniques. And then I think we have another fact sheet that ties into it as well. So that one's more of a, what is the Rangeland Analysis Platform? So all of this will be available to y'all to use if you're someone who's interested in using this type of stuff. And so my Texas Master Naturalists who are currently on this call, they're currently undergoing the RAP curriculum, or they're currently completing the RAP curriculum right now, and this is their training right now, so before they complete it. And I think I kind of went a little bit fast. I didn't want to cover some of the same stuff that our other speakers did. I just wanted to say thank y'all, and if you're interested in learning more about how the Prairie Project is getting extension agents and educators involved, extension agents and educators involved, how to use the RAP, use these different techniques, you can come check us out. We're the prairieproject.org. We're also at Prairie Restored on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we are constantly posting the latest science when it comes to these different techniques and different events that we're participating in, and maybe even some RAP workshops as well. So if you want to get an even deeper dive or complete this curriculum, we will have workshops available. So I think we have a couple questions in the chat, or
Erica, while we've got a few extra minutes, would you mind kind of giving us a brief summary of what your preliminary data is showing in terms of how students are learning, particularly our, K through 12 participants on the Prairie Project, how best they are learning about woody brush encroachment? Is it through the RAP alone? Is it the combination of ranch tours and the RAP? What are some of the things that you've been seeing given the last couple of years of your work on the Prairie Project?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've taken some of these 4-Hers and FFA kids just on a ranch tour out to these different ranches where they got to interact with the rancher one-on-one, and then also see the impacts of fire and grazing in different areas. And what I've seen in my data thus far, so when it comes to judging their attitudes on fire and on their confidence in knowing what there is to know about rangelands before and after we take them on these tours, they are so much more confident in their knowledge on rangelands, as well as what prescribed fire can do. And so when it comes to knowledge scores too, we can see that what we're doing out on these ranches is they are learning when they're out there. So they're learning not just from me, they're learning from this rancher. They're answering questions in regards to, the impacts, or can we graze, more than one species together? And we'll have them say, yes, they completely agree after these ranch tours are done. And so there's a really, at least right now with my ranch tour data, that has been the most powerful data that we've gotten, so that in-person interaction, I guess, where kids they're very hands-on when they're out there, and they're also running transects. But yeah, it's been most impactful with just taking these kids out, out of their school and onto these ranches for sure.
And also, Erica, in your opinion, has the rancher learned anything from having the participating youth in his pastures and on his operations?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's really easy to, when we start thinking about the next generation, it's really easy to kind of be like, oh man, they're just on their social media, on their phones all day. But when the ranchers actually get to interact with these kids, some of the kids that have been out to these ranches, they were actually picked up by these ranchers. So these kids started working for these ranchers, doing whatever kind of work that they needed to do out there. And it's just kind of changed their minds. It's made them more hopeful on this next generation. I think that's really important whenever you're taking these kids out there as well. So yeah, it's definitely had an impact on how our ranchers view the next generation of land stewards and agents of change, for sure.
Cool. Thank you. Any other questions for Erica? Okay, guys, since we've got a little bit of time to kill, we're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break, if that's okay. And we'll get back at it at 10:40 a.m. So give me about 5 to 6 minutes, and then do me a favor and log back on, or just stay on. And we'll get started with our next presentation, looking at the stocking rate calculations that exist on the Rangeland Analysis Platform. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for not only spending your morning with us, but being patient with us while we maneuver through share screens and through speakers. We really appreciate it. Erica is going to go ahead, if she hasn't already, put in the chat box a survey link to the pre-survey that we're using as part of the Prairie Project in order to determine how well we're doing in terms of teaching what the Rangeland Analysis Platform is, what the Prairie Project is, and how we can use all of these tools, whether they're management strategies or new technologies, to make better decisions on the ground and in the field. And so if you haven't already completed that pre-survey, please go ahead and do so. I know you've already heard from Dr. Donovan and Dr. Fogarty regarding what the Rangeland Analysis Platform is, but please do me a favor and go ahead and complete that survey, because that is the data that Erica is going to be using as part of her thesis when she is going to be writing up and hopefully defending soon. So let's give her all the great data in the world that we possibly can in terms of what is learned and how this has been impactful and used. Okay, I'm going to do a quick check on my slides. Erica, can you see the Rangeland Analysis Platform okay?
Yes, ma'am, it looks good.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit, but still stay within the Rangeland Analysis Platform. And I think what has probably been the coolest part about this is not only the ability to read cover from satellite imagery and then put it in a very user-friendly tool. If you can operate Google Earth and you can run the RAP, but probably what is, I think, more intriguing is the ability to learn more about pastures from a computer or from your office. And one aspect of that is the stalking rate tool that we have. Now, if you're like me, when you look out on the landscape, particularly on our grasslands, you're seeing fuel or you're seeing forage. And this particular part of today's training is going to lead more towards what does that forage look like? So I'm on the homepage of the Rangeland Analysis Platform. We've played around with the Launch RAP tool, but we're going to go ahead and focus on the Production Explorer tool. And I'm going to go ahead and click Launch Production Explorer. Okay, this Production Explorer is just what it sounds like. It's basically giving you all of the data that the RAP has, going all the way back to 1986. And also giving you current year data as well. Now, this gets pretty cool when we start thinking about triggers and thresholds for livestock managers and operations when a drought perspective is factored onto it. Now, Stephen already made a great comment about, well, what has the drought impact been? And could the drought have impacted the forage production that we were seeing on the Hoover K-Bar outside of Ozona? And the answer is absolutely yes. So with this data, we can identify those crucial thresholds of where we're at in forage production relative to the long-term average, and what kind of decisions do we need to make regarding temporal and spatial imagery that we now have available at our fingertips. Now, I want you to keep in mind everything that Dr. Donovan and Dr. Fogarty covered in their earlier presentations. This by no means is a cure-all, one-size-fits-all silver bullet answer. But what this does, it dramatically changes the amount of information, timely information, and depth of information that we have at our fingertips to make more adaptive and more rapid decisions. If you're like me, you saw the writing on the wall for a pretty intensive drought coming out of 2022 and into the spring of 2023. But when I was able to look at the RAP, I got an idea of what that looked like compared to other dry spells that we've had, and then also what that looked like in terms of other kind of crucial foundational threshold years that we relate and compare everything back to. If you're in my neck of the woods, which is Edwards Plateau country, West Texas country, you're going to compare everything back to 2011. That was the year that really changed a lot of operations and hopefully fundamentally helped producers better understand their landscape and how they can make more important and timely decisions. So let's look at what the Forage and Production Explorer of the RAP tells us. Now, Again, very similar as to how all this other information is relayed. And Erica, if I could go ahead and have you continue to monitor the chat box, because I want to take those questions as they come. Feel free to just interrupt me. I do not want to advance without someone asking the question. So we'll go ahead. The map is going to show up blank at first. So that's when you click on your import feature. Now, if you were like Erica and were super prepared for all of the data and the talks, then you would go ahead and have your shapefile built, and you could import that as a shapefile or as a KML Google file. I, however, was not super prepared. And so we're just going to focus in on an area the old-fashioned way. So the second you click on draw a feature, it brings up the map, and you can look at it using an address. You can look at it using a town. We're going to look at it just using a fundamental area. So type in El Dorado, Schlacker County, Texas, USA. That's going to get us right to the courthouse. We'll zoom out a little bit. Keep in mind too, we're still in that map or satellite option at the top right. So you can keep that satellite option off while you orient yourself to wherever it is you want to go. We're going to go east on 190 a little bit. Okay, once I kind of zoom in a bit, I'm going to switch over to my satellite imagery so I can get a feel for the terrain and the country that I'm looking at. And from there, I'm going to start drawing my area of emphasis or interest for you old school web soil survey users. This is just like a polygon drawing that you would use in Google Earth. You can build it using a square function, or you can build it using a polygon feature. We're going to kind of just focus on keeping things super simple today. And I'm going to just draw a square feature. Okay. Now notice how large of an area I drew. If I zoomed in a little bit closer, you could probably see the fence lines on what I drew on. But that's going to give us a little bit of variability, cross over a few different plant communities and different ESDs. And so again, you can quiet that down and isolate that area to tighten up that variability if you need to. But for now, let's just see how the program runs with it. After I draw my polygon, it will turn blue. And then I'm going to hit the black box that says calculate time series. Before I do that, I want to look at what's on the left side of my screen and make sure that my analysis period is where I want to be. So right now I'm at 2001 to 2022. I'm going to tighten that up to 2002 to 2022 to give us 20 years of data to look at. Now, if I wanted to drag that out all the way to 1986, I easily could, but keep in mind, the more data this thing has to process, the more it might chug down a little bit. So we'll calculate the time series. It's telling me it's loading, it's processing all of that data for the last 20 years within that blue polygon area. And it's going to spit out what my current year production looks like, my historical production, and all of those features that were at the top of your screen. Once you do that and you get this box that says congratulations, that means that it didn't shut down because of your data set, that everything was processed fine and everything's cruising along just fine with the data. So you can close that out. You're acknowledging that the data has been imported. And then now all of these grayed out buttons that were previously unavailable are now available to be used and looked at. So let's go ahead and start with current year production. Okay, again, it's just processing the data, and hopefully my system is not totally bogged down with it. Okay, Erica, can you see everything pulled up now?
Yes, ma'am. Everything looks good.
Cool, good. Okay, so what this basically did was make available the current year production based on that identified polygon area that I had. Notice the polygon, I didn't get completely to the south fence or that road that's on the west side. So it's not a super true rendition of that area of interest. If I wanted to tighten it up by building the polygon instead of the square feature, I certainly could. Or I could delineate across those plant community types that you see here to just tighten everything up. But what this is basically telling me is within that identified square area that I created, it's looking at the current year production as of May 24th, 2023, averaged across that entire site is 483 pounds per acre. And then it also breaks it down into the long-term average from the time period that I first set when I imported that data. So I recall the last 20 years, so from 2002 to 2022. Notice the current year, 2023, what 6 months of data or 5 months of data that we have, that's not factored into it yet. It will not be factored into the long-term average until the end of the calendar year. Okay, so average through is 645 pounds. But then again, we've got identifying features of how many pounds per acre we're looking at: 150% of average, 125% of average, 75 and 50% of average. So it gives you what you should be looking at regarding high and low years of forage production. Okay, so I could easily download this, and we're just going to call this, how about we call this Schlacker County for my land unit name. So you can customize this, you can put, identifiable names onto it regarding your audience type of whoever you're creating this work for. So if it's for a county extension agent or a landowner or a industry group that you might be working with, you can be pretty precise in how you're identifying this area. From
Dr.
there,
Treadwell,
yep, go ahead.
we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
So how current is the satellite imagery in the RAP tool, and is there a way to know the last date of the imagery? So going back to the forage production, remember, I'm only talking current production right now. It's as of May 24th. Okay, so we see that production as of May 24th. And I think I misspoke earlier. I did not say that 2023 data was in the long-term average, but it actually is. So it's the average through May 24th regarding high or low years compared to that long-term average. Now, if I wanted to go back and create a report for a different year, I easily could do that. I would just have to change this drop-down button, and I can go back all the way to 1986 for this same polygon area. I wouldn't have to recreate any of that. Okay. Now I'm going to stop share really quickly because it did spit out my report. The report that it's going to generate is going to be an Excel file. So it's not a PDF, but you can easily turn it into a PDF if you want to. Now, this is giving me the current year 2023 production report using the Rangeland Analysis Platform, a little bit of metadata at the top. It's got my identifiable feature that I built earlier on. The name of the report that I gave it, I called it Schlacker County, the date, and the long-term period that I set before I imported the data. So that 20-year period that I set. It puts everything into basically 2 columns. Okay, so it gives me what my long-term averages are looking at. Again, integrating that 2023 data. It gives me a current year data table. Notice it's broken down into 16-day production pounds per acre. So basically saying what was grown for 16 days after your date provided. So obviously the 16-day period from January 1st to 2023 is going to be 0, but then it builds on everything after that.
This gets to be pretty cool if you're bringing on livestock or if you're contemplating which pastures to move livestock in. When you start putting the art and the science of grazing management together, this is really detailed information that is readily available at your fingertips from your computer. It's not something you had to go out and clip for. It's not something you had to pay for. This is completely free data. Again, there is a little bit of variability that you have to assume when you are using this data. But again, pretty powerful data that gives me a solid starting place to work from when looking at my pastures in terms of productivity. Okay. It also gives me some really pretty graphs and features that give me comparisons of what 2023 is looking like in terms of that long-term average. Again, the same categories of 150%, 125, 75, and 50%. The black line that you see is 2023 data. And then it also breaks it down from the 16-day production plot, so a relatively short-term perspective compared to that longer-term perspective of a cumulative production plot. So here is the report that it was able to generate. And then if I click on the bottom tab, I can switch between my current year production and then looking at more of the historical production as well. So this is historical within the span of 2002 to 2022, looking at that same polygon area that I defined earlier, but it's breaking everything down into an historical data set of annual production, pounds per acre, and what percentage of average is that at? Was that an above average year in terms of precipitation or more below? This can also give you a pretty strong indicator of how often this particular plant community or area that I defined from my polygon is impacted by drought. How many years was I above 100% and how many years was I below it? And then again, it puts it all into a really cool figure that you can look at in terms of the long-term average of production in pounds per acre, going all the way back to that year span, data span that you laid out earlier when you first imported your data. Okay, so that's the production parts of what the report can look like for RAP. Let's go ahead and get back into the RAP itself. Okay, Erica, I'm assuming you're seeing the RAP back on the screen.
Yes, ma'am. Looks good.
Okay, so when I go back to the actual website, again, I can change that current year. If I am not a fan of what 2023 and the fact that we're only 6 months into it, I can go back to 2022 and it's going to give me the current year 16-day production estimates based on that 2022 data. I can change the name if I need to. And I can even start all over again and go back and say, hey, I don't think my square or polygon area of interest captured enough of that plant community or pasture. Maybe I want to be more on this bottom land that's over further on the eastern side. And I can maybe spend a little bit more time in getting more detail into those plots. Okay, current year plots. Let's look at some of this because I think it's really valuable information. This is the same data that we looked at in that Excel report printout that it chugged out. But let's say I want to compare it to other years. As ranchers, as managers, we're always comparing things to how bad it was or how bad could it get, right? I know at the beginning of 2023, I was pretty depressed at the lack of rainfall that we had not received. And I was really hoping we were going to pull out of that. But I also wanted to be realistic, and I also wanted to see how we were tracking to 2011. That's a benchmark year. So I can add another year to those plots. So again, I want to compare how 2023 was tracking in that defined polygon area compared to 2011. The blue line, I apologize if you're colorblind, but this is what it is. The blue line is 2011 data from the RAP compared to where we're at for 2023 in the black line. all within that 16-day production curve, and all compared to those long-term averages varying from 150% of average down to 50% of average. Okay, so again, this is very helpful information when you're just trying to identify those thresholds or trigger dates as to how much grass are you growing, how much forage is being produced, and where you sit in terms of that growing season and in terms of hopefully the peak growing season that is yet to come. Okay, again, if I wanted to compare it to a different year, let's kick it all the way back to 1986 and look at that. I've got rapid data at my fingertips comparing this year's forage production to previous years. Now we can do that all the way back from a cumulative annual perspective. Again, let's go back to 2011, comparing 2023 to 2011. And we can see that between January to probably honestly May, we didn't see that much of a distinction between those 2 years. So if I was a manager in 2011, boy, I'd want to know what I did and how I survived it or how I didn't survive it, and what lessons did I learn from that year, because looking at the data from 2023, we were certainly on track for a similar type of year. Okay, this is all within the current year production tab on our Rangeland Analysis Platform. Okay, let's kick it to historical production. So again, this is looking at that same identified area. Everything is relative to what we created. And again, the same name that we gave it. If I want to go back and change it, I easily can. If I want to change the long-term average, I have to go back to that import data site. Okay, so now we're looking at the long-term average for the last 20 years on this identified feature, and we're looking at an average annual production of around 1,800 pounds per acre. We can see that variation depending on an above average year or below average year. More importantly, we can see what the RAP looks like in terms of comparing it to the Web Soil Survey production estimates as well. So if you're familiar with the Web Soil Survey, it always gives you what the normal is, followed by a high precipitation year, favorable, or unfavorable. I think the phrases used in the soil survey are high and low. So we see that variation. We see what the differences are between the RAP and the soil survey. And we are definitely in the ballpark of looking at two different production estimates via satellite imagery for this feature. Okay, we scroll down, we can see that historical plot. Again, based on those long-term averages, the variation for those years defined for the last 20 years. Again, we should be able to pick up those really crucial threshold years. So in 2011, average at production around 850 pounds per acre. But then also those really flush years, so above average precipitation as well. We can also look at this data as a tabular data, and we can download this as well. And so if we want to create our own graphs with it or whatever, we can certainly do that. Again, all of this historical table was created in the Excel report. You just have to click on that tab, spreadsheet tab of the historical table data instead of the current year data. If I would have clicked the data all the way back to 1986, I would have seen everything going all the way back to 1986. I can, rearrange it however I'd like to see it done. So if I want my most recent year on top, 2022, I certainly can do that as well. Now, when I'm in this historical production report tab, no current year data is going to be factored into it. So that's a really good distinction between what the current year production tab will do for you versus the historical production. This is only relying on the previous year. So no current year data year to date is integrated into this data set. Cool. Okay. Stocking rate. This is where it gets really fun. Again, everything is going to be all the numbers that are going to be crunched are going to be referred back to that polygon area that I called it, but let's say I want to call it something else. So we'll just call it road pasture. If I need to adjust that land unit area because I'm not the best drawer on a computer, I certainly can. So if I want to kick it up to, let's just call it 250 acres, I certainly can. But there's lots of other things that I can adjust here. So the average size of the animal while grazing the land unit. Not everything has to be about cattle, right? Erica just got done telling you how much more productive your landscape can be in a savanna grassland system when we're looking at multi-species grazing. And so if I want to drop this all the way down to goat size, I certainly can. If I want to look at what Dorper sheep are looking at, I certainly can. If I've got a bigger cow than 1,000-pound animal, I certainly can. So let's kick it up to just 1,100 pounds. I can vary the days the livestock will be grazing this particular unit. So right now it's on a 30-day rotation out of 365 days. I don't like that. I'm more of a 2-week rotation. So let's kick it to 12, let's kick it to 15 days. That's about as close as I can get to 2 weeks with my cursor. Average intake percent of body weight that the animal consumes each day. Again, this is where you can vary based on your target grazing species that you're looking at. If you really are unsure of what that means, you can click that little I information box, and this will tell you exactly what they mean when they're saying what the average intake is. So for example, this is expressed as a percentage, 3% equating to 30 pounds of daily dry matter forage for a 1,000-pound cow and her calf. Pretty basic stocking rate information. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 3%. Let's say I have it's automatically defaulted to a 25% harvest efficiency. Let's leave it at 25% for now. And then I can also adjust the factor for slope and or distance to water. Okay, so we'll go ahead and leave it at 100% and just see what it gives us. We'll click calculate stocking rate. Now, another really cool feature, and this is really beneficial for county extension agents. Again, I can download this report and it's going to kick out another Excel file for me based on that stocking rate production. Proper stocking rate estimate using Rangeland Analysis Platform. Again, it's got my land unit picture in there. It's summarized all of those inputs that went into the model. For example, the area, the animal, the utilization, harvest efficiency rate. And then it kicks that out in terms of the annual summary data and estimated acres per animal. Okay, so basically everything that we could look at on the website is going to be integrated into this really cool and pretty Excel file that we can convert over to a PDF if need be and insert into a newsletter or social media, infographic, whatever it is that we need to cover. So again, let's go ahead and go back to our website. That was downloaded using the download report. And we'll just look at what we've got in terms of production and stocking rate. So it's going to give me the average, a low and a high value, and what that middle point is between the low and the high. Anytime there's any assumptions made or any model assumptions made, it's going to give you a note or some type of information box that you can click on for more information. Again, the wrap is phenomenal at putting really cool figures together. So here I've got the stocking rate time series plot based on that 20-year period that I created from the very beginning. If I want to download that as a PNG and then bring it back into a PowerPoint presentation, I certainly can. There's lots of different things that I can do and tools that I can do. If I want to reset my axes, if I want to anything that can be done within this graph, they've created a lot of flexibility with it. Okay, from there, they share the exact details of the stocking rate calculation, forage available in the field, individual animals forage demand for a grazing bout, and then the suggested number of head as well. All of this data was included on that report that was generated by downloading that report in the Excel file. Again, I can look at all of the data in a tabular version as well, going back to 2002 or earlier, just depending on where I built that time span. It's going to give me the herbaceous production for that year in pounds per acre, percent perennial production, percent annual production, estimated total animals for proper stocking, assuming my harvest efficiency rate that I outlined earlier, and estimated acres per animal. Now, if I'm looking through all of this and I don't really like what I'm seeing, I can come up here and I can adjust everything. So let's say that area is more like 300 acres and I'm more like 1,400 pound animals. And I want to be in it like 20 days. And I don't want them, I want to do more of a flash graze, mob graze. Recalculate, and all of those numbers will be adjusted based on the assumptions that I just created in that stocking rate. Okay, while it's thinking of some more numbers, is there any more questions in the chat box that I'm overlooking, Erica?
No, ma'am.
Cool. I overwhelmed it, I think.
Okay, we just got another question, Dr. Treadwell.
Okay.
The question is, are the rates being based off total annual production?
So, Kay, that depends on where exactly you're looking at. If you're looking at it from a oh, I wish I had this data pulled up. Let's hit it again to see if I can spur it along. It's looking at the most current year data that it has. Okay, so again, it's going back to 2022 in order to build all of those assumptions. The 2023 data isn't going to be added into this until the previous year. So I guess to answer your question, no, that current year 2023 data that we have from that current year production tab is not integrated into this.
Can you hear me, Morgan?
Yeah, I sure can, kid.
So I guess my question is, and I'm sorry, I'm not a very good typer. So like originally you had in there for 2 weeks or 15 days. Assuming that pasture hadn't been grazed prior to the 15 days, you're going to have less production available or less forage available in, like, say, May than what you might in August after you've had, 3 or 4 months of growth out there. I'm just trying to figure out, if you were doing a shorter than 180 day season, what it's basing the available forage to actually graze off of. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So those 16-day assessments, that was just based off of the current year production. That does not get factored into the stocking rate whatsoever. So when it's pulling up these stocking rate calculations based off of the lowest value or the highest value, that's based off of the 20-year period that I outlined earlier in the import data stage. So you really can't, you really can't use the stocking rate calculation tool to hone in on current production data for that grazing season, for that current grazing season. Does that make sense, Cade?
Yeah, I'm just, if you put like if you put 2 weeks in there for your grazing period, there's really there's no way to say when that 2 weeks is, so that it can go back and pull like the 16-day period, the same 16-day period for the 20-year average. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, it's not as precise. for that particular part. It's going to rely on all the data, previous year's data factored into it, and most likely it's going to, you know, hold it at peak growing season using those highest and low values generated,
I see. Okay.
all averaged from previous years.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. How current is the satellite imagery in the RAP tool? Is there a way to know the last date of imagery? So, Michael, I don't know if I answered this earlier, but everything in terms of what the stocking rate production explorer tab can do is going to be, especially if we went back to this current year production, it will tell you when that data was last updated. And so right now we're looking at everything year to date as of May 24th. Cool, thank you. Okay, guys, any other questions before I kick it over to Chase? Okay, cool. Chase, whenever you are ready, sir.
It would help if I muted myself, but sounds good. Let me flip over to PowerPoint, because I would not be a good government employee if I did not have an adequate PowerPoint prepared. All right, so I get to be the last person on the lineup, and I'm going to talk to you about how this, and I'll make your job easier. And so, you know, I guess I'll start for those of you who I haven't met or, you know, aren't familiar. I'm Chase Brook. I'm the new extension program specialist for small acreage management out of the Stephenville Center. But prior to that, I was a county extension agent for almost 5 years up in Collin County. And so I'm coming into this kind of wearing, you know, my program specialist hat, but also with the hope that, you know, I can really distill everything you've learned from all the previous presenters and the tools that they've shown you, and, you know, given you that knowledge about and how to make it fit what you need for your programs, and to try to simplify some of the things about your job, right? Because as we know with county agents, everyone loves to give y'all more work, but not always make things easier or take some off. And so hopefully this is a way to help to help give you some of those tools, and another way to communicate with your producers, you know, with your RPLs, DEAs, county commissioners, anyone who's interested in the information that comes out of the RAP. All right, so today, my objectives for the next 30 minutes are to help kind of puzzle piece where the RAP can meet what you're looking for, what you need, or maybe some programmatic or knowledge gap that you have or your producers have in your county, right? I'm going to very briefly run through just some of these tools that the REP gives us and how to apply them. I mean, all the previous presenters did an excellent job on, you know, really going through those tools, right? And so rather than just rehash the details, I'm going to kind of give a quick review. And then the part I really want to talk about, and where I'm really interested in y'all's feedback and questions, is on how we can integrate this into how you work with your clientele, your program plans, result demonstrations, things like that. So if you do have a question that comes up before then, feel free to just shout it at me, well, maybe talk it at me nicely, or you can put it in the chat, and I'm sure Erica or someone will be happy to bring it to my attention. All right, so in my experience, what do y'all want? And your DEAs, because at the end of the day, they're the ones doing your performance appraisal. You know, on the programming side, all of us, you know, and I'm going to include us, you know, program specialists and folks over here, we are all in the programming business. right? We want to create high quality, impactful programs, whether it is a, classroom workshop, whether it's a result demonstration, applied research project, we are looking to bring our landowners and our clientele a hell of a program that helps them do what they do better, right? Or easier, or make more money, or save money, or something along those lines, right? And along that, we also are all looking for good evaluations, right? And measuring how we're impacting our communities, And so, when I'm talking about this is one of the things that I am keeping very clear and upfront, is that, this is a tool that helps you meet those goals, right? I mean, if we were in person, I'd probably, ask how many of you do you have your program plans due this week? And I know some of y'all who, I think it varies based on district, but I know like District 4 was due this week, and this is something that is on the top of your mind, whether, obviously, whether you're done submitting your program plans for this year, or you're maybe really incredibly proactive and starting to think about next year's. This is a way that I want to make sure we can talk about it and integrate it into what you want to do, right? And on the non-programming side, I see this as a way to better communicate with our clientele about their land, right? And when I say clientele, it's more than just landowners, right? Yes, they are the bread and butter and backbone of what we do in extension, but all y'all county agents in particular, you also have stakeholders that are not just landowners, they're cooperating agencies, whether it's the NRCS, FSA, Texas Parks and Wildlife, local conservation groups, your county commissioners court, that local state representative that happens to call by every once in a while when one of their constituents has an ag-related question. Being able to have the tools available to increase your knowledge and expertise without increasing that workload is always going to be kind of a valuable, tool in the Swiss Army knife of extension, right? And so, like I said, this is just kind of how I encapsulate what we want, what we need, and I say what agents, RPLs, DEAs, and folks want to see from, as outputs from agents generally, right? And so when I look at the RAP and what it can do, I mean, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we had a lot of other people do a great job providing way better detail on it. But basically, when I was thinking it through, building this PowerPoint, it kind of came down to 4 bullet points, right? The first is showing your actual grazable acres, right? Because 9 times out of 10, and I speak on this from a new landowner perspective, because that's one of the things that I specialize in and have a lot of programming interest in. But I'm certain many of y'all agents have had the new landowner come into your office. They just bought a piece of property. It's 50 acres or 200 or 2,000, whatever. And their first assumption is that if they want livestock, they can count every single square foot of that property, as grazable, right? Oftentimes it's because they don't, it's just a lack of experience in determining exactly how much is grazable. And at best, I know many of the landowners I interacted with as a county agent, they could give you a rough estimate, like, maybe about 30%, 40%, you might pull up Google Maps and just give it basically a scientific wild ass guess and, move on with it. But this gives you a way to be detailed, right? Because when we're working with our new landowner clientele, and our clientele in general, one of the things that makes them successful is planning, right? And if we are making, at an extension, we give a lot of advice. And if we want to give good advice, it needs to be based on good data and a good understanding of their situation. So being able to even see something just like how many acres of grass, or basic, do I have, and then you take that over along with what Morgan had just showed with your stocking rate, your carrying capacity, and some of the previous presenters on looking at loss of productivity over time, that gives you a picture and a story that you can take to your landowner. Because 9 times out of 10, that landowner buys that piece of property and that is how they expect it to be, right? Sometimes you get superstar landowners or superstar conservationists who understand that many times the land that they are purchasing or inheriting has been encroached by woody plants and has inherited some of the issues of previous landowners. But when you have someone without those preconceptions, they come in and they see, oh, well, it's covered in trees. Well, of course, it's meant to be a forest, right? And being able to show them that, no, really, we have data going back to the 1980s that this is, factually, this was a prairie, or this is historically where you had trees, and everything you see over here is new. And not only is it new, it's basically putting the landowner in a situation where they are losing their economic revenue generation potential. It is increasing their expenses, and it gives you a way to kind of bring that message home, right? It's more than just expert knowledge. It's expert knowledge backed by data and pretty maps and graphs, right? And as someone who got his undergrad in making pretty maps and graphs, I tend to be a little biased that I think they can be very helpful for some people to just have something to look at and take home with them. And I think also this is a way, again, through some of that programming we'll talk about later, that you can train your landowners to do this work for you. And in a perfect world of sunshine and rainbows, or maybe rainfall and rainbows is better in Texas, but you can have a scenario where you are training landowners to be better conservationists by using the tools that are available to them. Because many times tools are either unknown or challenging to use, or more frequently both. And I think RAP, the RAP has the ability to be very user friendly. And it's just a matter of giving them that initial exposure and getting them over that initial hump of the challenge of learning how to use a new program, right? And that kind of takes me on to some of the limitations, and I know some of the technical limitations were definitely covered earlier, but kind of thinking at it from the 10,000 foot view, or maybe the agent's desk view, I mean, some of the challenges are, one, it takes time, right? When we're looking at pulling through a analysis and being able to come up with these graphs and these maps and things like that, I mean, it can take 10 to 30 minutes depending on what you're trying to do, right? And so if you have a client in your office and you're trying to show them something about this, it may not be the best use of your time in the moment. It might be, depending on what you're talking about. But if you know that you want to talk about something like this, getting their address ahead of time and then just doing a good enough calculation and wrap so that when they come in your office, it's ready. That's just something to keep in mind. I'm also going to say, and I'm thinking of some of our more established producers, shall we say, it takes some computer skill. I hosted one of these workshops, and about half of my group were under the age of 40, and about half of the other half were over the age of about 65, right? And all of them were able to eventually work on it and run through the process. But I had a landowner, he came in and he brought his spouse with him because, as he put it, she was the one who does the computer work. He was still interested in learning, but you have to be cognizant that sometimes not everyone has that computer skill or the ability to pick up a new skill on a computer just from the get-go. And just keep that in mind. And some of the activities like Erica talked about and some of the resources that are available can help offset that. It does require an internet connection. So especially for those of you all out in West Texas or in other parts of the state where cell service is not a given, or internet connection is not a given, this can be a really hard sell to someone who maybe has to go to their public library in town to get access to the internet, or has, you know, a very slow satellite connection with a data cap. And then finally, I will say this is not very easy to use on a cell phone. I was playing around with it yesterday while I was polishing up this presentation, and it just really doesn't translate well. Same thing with Apple computers. The way the file systems and the operating systems work, it's just not a very easy experience, right? And so like it can be done, don't get me wrong, but it does work better in some systems than others. And then what I'll also say though is, as you see at the very bottom underlined, these are not necessarily any different than some of the other programs we use. Like it is leaps and bounds easier to use than Web Soil Survey, right? If any of y'all have had the interesting experience of that, or maybe something a little more polished like Soil Web. Yeah, none of these are insurmountable for either program, and these limitations are not just unique to RAP. All right, so that's enough about that, and I'm gonna focus more on what y'all are probably really interested in, which is how can we make it work for you, right? And this is where I'm gonna talk a little bit more, and where I would really love to hear, you know, some questions if you got them about, you know, these different scenarios I envision and how this could work for your situation in your county, things like that, right? You know, I mean, and kind of like I talked about earlier, the first one is really just that one-on-one with clientele, right? Whether it's in your office, whether it's by email, whether it's on a farm visit, you know, this is your tool to tell a story and to illustrate it with data, right? And to give you, you know, some more concrete data to give them in the sense of, I know when I was a county agent, if you asked me what was the stocking rate for Collin County, I would tell you it's going to be 5 to 7 acres per animal unit on well-managed Bermuda grass. But if you're on native grass, it's going to be about 8 to 10. And if you're on heavily degraded pasture, it's going to get even worse, right? And the ballparks are great for ballparks, you know, and, you know, I don't want to discount that knowledge, but sometimes you might come in and someone, especially with small acreage properties, where you just have fewer resources available, and therefore you need to be able to optimize and understand to the exact nearest hundredweight how much forage is being produced. That's where this comes in handy, you know. And, you know, again, I'll use an example. In Collin County, our appraisal district said you had to have 2 animal units on a property for a minimum of 181 days per year to qualify for your ag use valuation. Well, with a tool like RAP, suddenly we can figure out which 6 months are the best 6 months to stock that property, right? Which 6 months might be the most productive, and, you know, which ones would be able to get you the best return on an investment, whether it's, you know, minimizing purchasing feed or getting the most high quality nutrition, whatever that may be, right? And so this empowers you in a sense. And I would also say this is something that, you know, like I said, it could be via email. It could be done via, you know, when someone's in your office, or you can print it out and take it on print out with you when you're going on a farm visit or a site visit, right? So let's see, if we don't have any questions, I'll keep going, or I can hang out here for a second. All right. You know, and so kind of this is where we get to be, you know, we're going from one-on-ones, you know, or small group kind of conversations and going into a more formal program, right? And I use program in the extension sense, where we are spending time to create an educational activity to teach people a skill that they will then be hopefully evaluated on, right? And this can be a couple of different ways, right? And you know, you can see the picture on the right. That's the producer meeting. That's the rack training I held last year, or no. Yeah, I think it was last year, 2021. It was 2022. So, so we held this class in May, and we worked with a local community college to get a computer lab, and we were able to bring people in and teach them the skills using the curriculum that Erica developed, right? And, the focus was predominantly on how can these producers, these clientele use this tool to improve their production, make better land management decisions and make more informed land management decisions, right? At the same time, this is the exact kind of tool you can turn around to other groups, right? You can take it to master volunteers. Say you have a master naturalist chapter, and they have an interest in seeing how land cover has changed in their county, in maybe one of the natural areas they manage or something like that. And this can help give them context for the volunteer work they're doing or the importance of the work they're doing, right? And then I think the last one is a group that, I have found very fruitful to work with in extension as an agent, as a program specialist, is working with your cities. So, many times counties or cities manage open space, right? Whether it's parks, whether it's just that lot that they're eventually going to turn into an elementary school one day, whatever that may be. And this is a way for you to educate them and give them a tool in how they're managing the public lands in your county. And so, for example, a group I would work with often is I worked with several parks and rec departments who had an interest in restoring natural open space in their parks, into prairie, into what would be a native rangeland environment, things like that. And this was a tool that they could use to, again, see what that historical state was, right? Give them a snapshot into the past to see how, that landscape used to look, the productivity of it, and, even things like, if they wanted to use a prescribed fire on that city park, well, under, in certain years, they can see how that productivity, wanes and ebbs with, annual climate variation, right? So just, I would say keep an open mind, and, this is a much more flexible, this is a very flexible tool beyond just, what we can show to, a rancher or a landowner. And don't be afraid of kind of spitballing that a little bit. I think everyone who's presented in this talk today has a vested interest in helping you understand the program, how it can help you with your programming, and kind of sharing the good word about the RAP and what it can do for you. Any questions on this? Cool. And I will also say, just on this note, it's a pretty straightforward program to put together, right? If you don't have a computer lab handy at a community college or a local school or something like that, or a library, you may be able to do a bring your own device kind of setup. You may, or have people try to follow along while you do it, kind of like we've done in this talk, or in this series of presentations today, right? And let's see, yeah. So that just, again, kind of some ideas for you to take and play with and see if it fits your needs or your clientele. Let's see, and then kind of the last bit, when I was a county, go ahead. Did someone talk?
Nope, you're good, Chase.
Okay, I'm just hearing things, I guess. Let's see. So, and kind of the last bit that I think is kind of critical from an agent perspective is that result demonstration, right? And, there's an expectation that those are done, frankly. And this is one that I would say is pretty straightforward to put together, right? You can have a classroom component, then link it to a field, field transect, or, vegetation transects, things like that, kind of like you see in the picture here. I think the potential is there to talk about things like, the raft, and especially if they're already familiar with it from a previous program, talk about what Erica and some of, the other folks on here talk about, how important ground truthing is, right? And understanding that relationship between what you see on your computer to what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, and I put this down here. So the actual teaching time on these things can be as simple as a 1 to 2 hour classroom period for, an initial program and a 1 to 2 hour field demonstration. And then suddenly you have 2 programs, one of which is a result demo, which you can include in your plan of work for, any number of different kinds of plans, right? Because it relates to natural resource conservation, ecological restoration, livestock production, forage management. I think there's a lot of flexibility on the planning side to kind of squeeze this puzzle piece in there. And yeah, I mean, that really, if you're looking for some of these resources, I looked online and, Erica, I'm sure you're familiar with these in all caps, but we do have 2 publications out through AgriLife, RWFM PU 407 and 408, have a very concise description of the RAP and how to use it to measure land cover change. So that's a handout you can give. I also know, as was mentioned earlier, I mean, Erica has her curriculum, which these are based off of, right? And, being able to, yes, teach it yourself, but also be able to, some clientele, they just want to do it themselves, and you can give them a publication and they're happy and go on their way, right? And then at the bottom, just again, the people on this call, right? If you have questions about RAP, its uses, how to integrate it into programs, I guess I'm going to speak for most of the other people here in that we are interested in answering your questions and how you can integrate this tool into your workflows. And so if you do have questions, please reach out. Let's see. And yeah, I mean, and again, so this was just kind of a quick blast through how we can take this tool, we can make it work for you and your programs and your needs. If you have questions, let me know. It's Tuesday. I only bite people's heads off on Monday, so y'all are safe.
Thank you, Chase. That was really cool. Let's go ahead and open it up for just a general discussion with all of our speakers. Erica has typed in the post survey in the chat box. Please complete that. We need to know how y'all felt about this training opportunity, if there was anything more specific you would like to see, and if you enjoyed our speakers and all the different topics that we covered. So please give us your feedback and also just your general feedback on what you learned about the RAP. That's going to be very beneficial for Erica in a couple of months. Okay, guys, any discussion questions or anything like that? Feel free to unmute or type them in the chat box. Chase, I'll go ahead and kind of jumpstart this.
Yeah.
Do you think the likelihood of using this data for ranchers is extremely high? And then after you, I'm going to pivot over to Dillon to see what we've got in store for how other agencies could potentially use this data.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think really, like I alluded to earlier, it really depends on that rancher, right? And it really depends, there's always that scale of, adoptability that people are on. Some people are just, go-getters, they're up, they want to do all the cutting edge, top of everything. Some people tend to be a little more hesitant, all the way down to recalcitrant sometimes. And I think where RAP falls in is for those folks who are really being proactive in wanting to spend more time getting that detailed data to fine tune their operation. Right? There's a group of clientele who are perfectly comfortable with that general 20 to 30 acre stocking rate, and that's what they operate off of, and they sleep great at night. But we also know that there are some producers who, I mean, if they can min-max this thing and dial it in so that if they remove, you know, the junipers from this pasture, they can squeeze an extra 2 sheep into their operation and make an extra $400, you know, a year, whatever that is. You know, I think those are the people who are best captured by this, right? You know, and they are the ones who, you know, not just for the utility, but when they have a good experience with it and they implement it, and then they love the result that, you know, that they got out of it, then they're the ones who tell their neighbors and get that general interest, and even, you know, can refer them back to that county agent, you know, or specialist or whoever would be the best referral for it.
Yep, I totally agree. Dillon, what's in the works for this down the road, and how can we align what we know from the RAP and all the amazing tools afforded on it to brush management? How can we be more effective with those dollars that we're spending?
Yeah, really good question. Well, I'll just start, I guess, with talking about the groups we've worked with in Nebraska and across the plains. There's the conservation agencies. There's a huge demand for getting these products into their hands and making them more accessible so that they can use them on the planning side for landowner engagement. And so there's a lot of work right now happening behind the scenes to make all of these tools more accessible. It's really changed the way we can plan and think about managing woody encroachment. You know, we're really rapidly understanding it more as a biome problem rather than a pasture property county problem. So we're gonna continue to see those tools be more accessible and allow us to fine tune how we plan and manage woody encroachment.
Do you see this being a fairly reliable tool for folks like the NRCS moving forward? And if so, is there particular cost sharing programs that could be tied to what the RAP is telling us in terms of ceiling exposure or brush or anything like that?
Yep. And that's NRCS programs in different states are already incorporating RAP, and that's going to be done a little bit differently on a state-by-state basis. But in Nebraska, they're already using that to help rank applications and identify more of those cost-effective opportunities for putting programs out. They've actually launched the Great Plains Grassland Initiative, which covers Oklahoma, which currently covers Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota. And there's talk about expanding into additional states in the Great Plains with the approach. But that brings in, definitely brings in RAP data and helps them use that in their planning process.
Yeah, gosh, knowledge is power, right? Especially when you're still planning it and thinking it through. And I know we can say what we have been doing isn't working, right? Based on the alarming rate of encroachment. So yeah, let's try something different. Let's see what we can do with more information.
And I'll add to, RAP comes in at kind of that landscape level or even broader geographic planning. It's not replacing field inventory. They're actually integrating RAP information with their field inventory now as that ground truth and quality control step. So it's not replacing, boots on the ground knowledge.
Right. It's complementing it.
It's complementing, yep.
It's equipping them before they go out to the field and kind of giving them the lay of the land before they get out and spend the time in the field. So golly, if I can be more efficient out in the field, then by all means, show me the way. We had a question in the chat box that's getting into land fragmentation and development. And I know that's a really interesting conversation to have. Amber's asking us, do any of our studies discuss the effects of fragmentation from increased development? And if that is also impacting woody encroachment? And yes, Amber, we're studying very rural areas. I know within our Prairie Project demonstration research ranches, those are definitely rural areas. And so it's very easy to identify the management strategy that is being deployed, but you're absolutely right. In urban areas and as suburban development encroaches, it will be more difficult to apply prescribed fire. And so there's a lot of different layers into this conversation. For example, prescribed burn associations and what's going on in the Les Hills, like the example that Dillon shared earlier. But I think fundamentally we can all agree on the fact that this is going to happen, whether or not we're in a rural area or in a suburban area. And Chase brings a lot of expertise to the table too when we start talking about smaller acreages, but yet these problems don't go away. And so, Dillon, is there any idea on what ideas on maybe the scale of the RAP? Or a lot of folks sometimes tend to tune out because they think that the RAP may not apply to their 5 acres. Is there any insight as to the scale of how you interpret the RAP or apply the RAP?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. You might know really well what's happening on your 5 acres, but the RAP helps you understand where that 5 acres sits within the county, the biome, the state, and kind of what's going on at the scales above of just the ranch level, which can be really helpful thinking about kind of the long-term management of a site.
Chase, in your experience and what you've seen with small acreage landowners, do you see the potential for landowners to pull together their pieces of land to create a larger footprint of managing this problem? Or what's kind of the cultural will in your experience that you've seen in North Central Texas?
I would say when we have a group of people like that who can pull together and really build that community, it is absolutely possible. I will also say one of the most, I don't know if in demand is maybe the best term, but one of the more popular talks from agents for stuff like this is just talking even more basic about neighborship, right? How do you be a good neighbor in rural property, and why is it important to know your neighbors? And that's something that I know some agents and I have started really hitting home on. And that's again more for new landowners and small acreage. On the small acreage side, I think that I've seen a bunch of different ways that can catalyze and crystallize itself, right? Sometimes that's through a shared, as much as I'm going to say a dirty word, sometimes these properties have HOAs, and with the right people, that can be a means to an end, right? And also maybe a more fun organization would be something like some of the wildlife associations, and even, you might have a rancher who, divvies up his property, but still has the same herd of cattle, just he moves those cows through a lot more gates, right? Having that shared nexus of connection can do that. And so I know that's a very kind of wishy-washy answer for kind of a short question.
No, and there's no right or wrong answers. What I love about the RAP is we can tell that long-term story to newer landowners who maybe don't totally understand that this hasn't always been a juniper woodland, and that has happened in a relatively short period of time. And so, just because you bought a piece of property or inherited a piece of property doesn't mean it has to stay like that. It doesn't mean it's always looked like that. And so we can really see the level of brush encroachment and tree encroachment into these open spaces and areas. And I know I can talk science and share the data all day long, but when I show that figure of the encroachment and the scale at what it is occurring, that gets people's attention more more times than not. So
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And what I would say too, for the agents on here, that is the direct line. So that catches their interest. You know, if you're fishing for their interest, that's what gets them biting the hook. What reels them into the boat is when you start connecting that to their goals, right? When you start saying, by leaving this alone and letting it, afforest itself. I think I probably just butchered English grammar right there, but as you bring that to, if they want to make money on a property, unless they're going to sell cedar fence posts, they're out of luck, right? If they want to not have a high operating cost, or high operating expenses, well, that's kind of a pipe dream anyway for anyone on here who owns property, as y'all know. But that makes everything harder, right? If they have erosion problems, the more woody plants you have, depending on where you are, if you're on a steep slope, you can lose that soil retention capacity that grasses give you. And so, it's about making that connection and then, pushing it, keeping it in their realm of interest, right? And that's really all I had to add to it. But just, oftentimes with stuff like this, you bring in a landowner. I always like to tell people in my presentations, it's really easy to get fired up about it when you're watching the PowerPoint, you're sitting in front of the training and you're doing it with help. But when they go home, everything's different. Everything's harder. Everything, just the magic energy of the workshop is gone. Right. So how do we make them want to put forward that effort? And that comes into that connection. It comes into that connection with their goals, their objectives, and just as much sometimes what the future they do not want to come to pass. Right.
yep. Well, on that note, Dillon, can you tell us a little bit more about this amazing pocketbook guide that you have coming up? And how can we get access to it? And then we'll take any last minute questions and close out for the day.
Yeah, definitely. So the pocket guide, again, I guess I'll say it came together in December last year at a workshop we had at the Arbor Day Foundation in Nebraska City. Morgan came up along with other extension and NRCS specialists from across the Great Plains. And we met on integrating new guidelines for managing woody encroachment with a formal planning process. And so what the guide does is it takes this vulnerability guide that was published in 2021, and it connects it to a planning process on rangeland. So it goes further than what our initial encroachment guide did. It walks landowners or extension agents or private lands biologists through that planning process. It gives them resources to educate people on what we're trying to looking at the problem through that lens of risk, and identifying those earlier stages in the front lines of the problem. We walk through inventory, talking to your neighbors and building cultural will, highlighting ecosystem services like Chase mentioned that are also tied to, if we manage woody plants, we're going to have the wildlife communities we want, the forage production we want, the water resources that we want. Depending on, where you're at, those ecosystem services differ, but bringing those into the fold. We then introduce a decision support process that actually walks people through alternatives for managing different parts of the encroachment process. So if you have an infestation, what are your options for reducing vulnerability? We have the recommended options for maximizing how you can reduce vulnerability on your site. We also have options that are not recommended. So it walks people through kind of that thought process on what are my options given where my site's at today. So we're really excited. We'll have sending it to the printers this week. So we'll have printed copies of a select number of printed copies available in July, and we're working to get a ordering process set up that'll be communicated and distributed through the Great Plains Extension Partnership. So Morgan will have more on that later on how you can order copies.
Yes, and also Dylan, I had several requests for the vulnerability and risk guide come in too while we were talking through this. So
That's
a
great.
lot of good requests for amazing materials and resources that you and Dr. Treadwell have developed. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think that we are going to go ahead and close out. I just want to thank all the guest speakers for taking time out of their day today to deliver this talk. Y'all did a phenomenal job. Like, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody who attended this event as well. I will work on getting all those links to publications and websites sent out to everybody. If you haven't yet, please fill out that post survey. I posted it in the chat. I'll also send it again in a follow-up email. But I hope everybody has a great rest of their week. And thank you again. All right.
Thanks a lot, Erica. Great job. Thank